The chamber is dim. A single candle burns in the corner, its flame shivering against the chill stone walls. Outside, the courtyard lies quiet. No trumpets, no laughter, no burst of celebration. Only a faint murmur of attendants exchanging cautious glances, as if joy itself must be measured. A child has been born, but not the one the kingdom hoped for. The midwife whispers something to the nurse, who folds the tiny bundle closer to her chest. A daughter. The word lands softly, like dust. In these rooms of power, silence begins before the first breath. The nurse hums an old lullaby, one meant to soothe, but it carries a note of apology. Somewhere beyond these walls, a father receives the news with a practiced smile that hides his disappointment, and a mother lies still, staring at the canopy above her bed. She knows her worth will now be weighed against this outcome. Outside, bells that once rang for sons remain untouched. The air itself seems to hesitate, waiting to know whether this birth will be celebrated or endured. Across medieval Europe, this scene repeats itself in 100 palaces. In France, in Spain, in England, daughters enter the world as secrets. They are blessings, whispered rather than sung. For a king, a daughter means diplomacy, not dynasty. She is a future bride, a vessel for treaties, a promise to be traded when the time is right. Yet, in the quiet between candlelight and cradle, something else is taking shape. Beneath the hush of duty, a small heartbeat insists on being heard. The years unfold like embroidery, delicate, patterned, restrained. In the nursery of Eleanor of Aquitaine, laughter is allowed, but not too loudly. Her tutors bow when she enters, though their reverence hides instruction. Every lesson is a warning dressed as wisdom. Hold your tongue, choose your words, watch before you act. The girl listens, and the listening becomes habit, then nature. The art of silence, taught like prayer, settles into her bones. When she curtsies, when she writes, when she smiles, each motion carries calculation. Elsewhere, in Castile, another girl grows beneath the same invisible rule. Isabella, small and solemn, sits at her desk, copying scripture while her confessor murmurs lessons on obedience. Around her, courtiers whisper that she is too quiet, too thoughtful for her age. They do not see that silence is already her armor. In the echo of her mother's anxious footsteps, Isabella learns that even affection can be political. Love itself must bow to duty. The world outside the nursery is loud, clashing armies, arguing priests, merchants shouting prices in crowded squares, but the world within the royal household is a theatre of restraint. The servants lower their voices when passing doorways. Curtains muffle laughter. Even music seems to understand its limits. Every gesture of these young girls is recorded, every expression interpreted. A frown might be defiance, a smile might be deceit. So they learn to move without revealing, to think without showing, to breathe without disturbing the air. Sometimes, late at night, the young Eleanor listens to the sounds below her window. The chatter of stable boys, the bark of dogs, the simple life unfolding without witness. She wonders what it feels like to speak without permission. She imagines the warmth of noise, the clatter of an ordinary home where words are not weighed like gold. In her world, language is currency, and she has not yet earned the right to spend it. The church reinforces this training. Priests preach that a woman's virtue lies in modesty, that the tongue is the door to sin. Paintings of Eve hang in hallways as eternal caution, her open mouth blamed for paradise lost. In every chapel, the image repeats, silence equals holiness. For a princess, holiness equals survival. The girls kneel, fold their hands, and absorb the lesson more deeply than any doctrine. To be quiet is to be safe. To be silent is to exist without risk. But in the quiet corners of their rooms, rebellion begins in secret. Eleanor hides forbidden poetry beneath her prayer book, words that speak of storms and passion. Isabella stares too long at the crucifix, not in worship but in questioning. The seeds of thought sprout in darkness. They are not yet acts of defiance, only whispers of possibility. Yet those whispers will someday echo through thrones and councils. The narrator's voice softens, almost like a memory. They were told silence was virtue, but virtue was only the mask of control. Each girl grows within the confines of this rule, her curiosity reshaped into patience. By the time they stand before their tutors, they already understand the invisible hierarchy of sound. Men speak, women interpret, men decide, women endure. And yet, endurance has its own kind of intelligence, a quiet knowledge of what cannot be said but must still be known. Years pass. The girls become symbols. They learn to walk with heads bowed just enough to appear humble, but not so low as to seem weak. Their lessons include not only scripture and languages, but the choreography of submission. How to pause before answering. How to show approval without words. How to smile when hearts ache. How to remain still while decisions are made about their futures in rooms they are not allowed to enter. Eleanor watches her father negotiate alliances, hearing names of men she will never meet, but will one day be bound to. Isabella watches the court crumble around her mother, learning that silence cannot always shield you but can delay destruction. Their innocence fades not through scandal, but through observation. They see how easily affection can be withdrawn, how swiftly loyalty shifts when power trembles. Silence becomes their refuge, and soon their only language. The narrator pauses again, the tone almost tender. It is in the nursery, not the throne room, where queens are truly made. They are shaped not by the weight of crowns, but by the weight of expectation. Each lullaby, each rule, each quiet command teaches them to read a room before speaking, to measure the mood of men before choosing words. The world mistakes this for grace. They know it is survival. Sometimes they dream of noise markets, laughter, songs in the streets, but the dream always ends the same way, with a door closing softly, shutting them back into silence. The candle burns down, the wax pools like time itself melting. Childhood ends, not with age, but with awareness. They realize the walls have ears, that even their prayers may be overheard. And so, before they ever wear crowns, they master the oldest art of power, restraint. The world will one day see their poise, their dignity, their calm authority, and call it noble. But they will remember the nights when it began, the hush after their birth, the unspoken sorrow in their mother's eyes, the echo of bells that never rang. The story breathes out gently now, settling into the rhythm of inevitability. The girls grow into women, their silence polished to perfection. They have learned that to survive is not to speak louder than others, but to listen more deeply. In their stillness lies a strange strength, one that the world will misinterpret again and again. For now, the chamber fades into darkness. The candlelight trembles once more, then steadies as if the flame itself has learned composure. Beyond these walls, the world moves toward coronations and wars. But inside, two futures wait, quiet and watching. Their time will come. And when it does, the silence that once confined them will turn into something far more dangerous. A choice. And thus, the cradle closes, and the stage begins to form. The next act will unfold in public view, where obedience becomes ceremony and silence becomes spectacle. Morning breaks through the high windows in threads of pale gold, illuminating rows of young girls seated in silence. Their dresses rustle faintly, the only sound in a hall that seems to have forgotten laughter. A tutor clears his throat and begins to read from a book of moral instruction. Every word drips with reverence, as if even wisdom must obey hierarchy. Grace, he says, is the mark of noble blood, and obedience is the truest grace of all. The girls bow their heads, not in agreement, but in habit. They have heard the same words every day since they learned to speak. In these classrooms of lineage, silence is a subject as real as language. The art of how to sit, how to breathe, how to react without revealing thought. It is all part of the curriculum. The daughters of kings and dukes are not raised to think freely. They are trained to symbolize virtue. Every gesture must be delicate, every reply restrained. They are taught to smile at command, to hide curiosity behind courtesy. What begins as posture soon becomes psychology. By the time they are 12, they already understand that too much brightness of mind can be mistaken for pride, and pride, in women, is sin. The church hovers over this education like an unseen overseer. In every sermon, in every letter sent from priest to palace, obedience is sanctified as holy. The Virgin Mary becomes the perfect model not because she spoke, but because she submitted. The girls kneel before her image, eyes lowered, lips moving in practiced prayer. Yet behind those folded hands, something stirs. They wonder, quietly, what it must have felt like to be chosen without consent. The thought passes like a flicker of heresy and is buried before it blooms. Mothers play their part too, repeating the lessons of their own restraint. A queen's strength is in her composure, they whisper while braiding their daughter's hair. Patience makes power invisible. The advice is given tenderly, but the tenderness is threaded with fear. These women know the cost of speaking too boldly, of wanting too visibly. They pass down their caution the way others pass down jewels. Each phrase is both a warning and a wound, love wrapped in survival. Eleanor listens to her tutors recite lines of Latin, but what she truly studies is the rhythm of authority. She learns how certain words command attention, how tone can silence disagreement. She begins to mimic power before understanding it. When corrected, she lowers her gaze immediately, yet inside, her thoughts remain active, alive, quietly defiant. The teacher sees submission, she feels strategy. Even as a child, she begins to understand the difference between appearing obedient and being conquered. Isabella's lessons take a different shape. Her instructors are monks who believe that silence sharpens faith. They make her copy scripture, line after line, until her fingers ache, teaching that endurance is holiness. She complies without complaint, but within her calm there grows a subtle awareness. Repetition does not erase, thought it deepens it. The more they make her write the same words, the more she begins to question their meaning. "Thy will be done," she murmurs, and wonders whose will that truly is. Beyond books and prayer, there are subtler lessons embroidered into daily life. The needle becomes the first instrument of silent rebellion. As they stitch flowers and saints into fabric, the young princesses learn to hide ideas within patterns. A vine that curls the wrong way, a petal painted too dark, each is a code, invisible to the men who inspect their work. Their embroidery becomes a language of the unsaid, a secret conversation passed from hand to hand. In this quiet labour, intelligence finds its disguise. Music serves the same purpose. The lute and harp are acceptable pursuits for noble women, safe outlets for beauty. Yet behind the soft melodies lies structure, mathematics, precision. When Eleanor plucks a string, she senses the order beneath the sound, the symmetry that governs chaos. When Isabella sings a hymn, she feels something ancient moving through her, something not entirely obedient. They are praised for their grace, not realizing that grace is how genius learns to survive in chains. Portraits from these courts capture only the surface. We see the still faces, the downcast eyes, the careful hands resting on folded skirts. But the painter's brush cannot capture what lives beneath, the pulse of thought, the flicker of questions too dangerous to voice. Each portrait becomes a mask, and yet every mask reveals what it tries to hide. The calm is too perfect, the silence too loud. Letters between queens and their tutors reveal a deeper complexity. Some survive in archives, ink faded, margins crowded with tiny notes. The words are formal, polite, obedient, but between them lie hints of sharp intellect, curiosity pressed into the shape of decorum. "I have read the treatise you recommended," one girl writes, "and I find its reasoning delicate." The understatement is deliberate. She cannot say what she truly thinks, that the reasoning is flawed, that the author fears what he cannot control. So she buries critique inside compliment, a hidden blade wrapped in silk. The narrator's tone turns quieter, almost reverent. They were not empty vessels, but mirrors polished too often. The constant reflection of others, fathers, priests, tutors, teaches them how to see without being seen. Over time, perception becomes intuition. They learn to read moods before words are spoken, to sense danger in tone, to recognize the tremor of power before it shifts. What men mistake for passivity is observation refined to instinct. One day, during a lesson on royal lineage, a tutor asks Eleanor to recite the family motto. She does so flawlessly, then hesitates, as if about to ask a question. The tutor notices. "Yes?" he prompts. She opens her mouth, then closes it. The moment passes. Later, she cannot remember what she wanted to ask, but she remembers the fear of asking. That is the true lesson. Hesitation as inheritance. The narrator lingers on this image, the pause, the swallowed question. Multiply it by generations, and you have the architecture of monarchy itself. An empire of unspoken words. built on the quiet compliance of daughters trained to serve as symbols. But symbols, once made conscious, become dangerous. Awareness is the beginning of fracture. Within that fracture, thought blooms like a secret garden. At twilight, the young princesses retire to their chambers. Tutors gone, servants dismissed, they are finally alone with their books. The pages smell of wax and dust, the script thick with the weight of centuries. Some nights, Eleanor opens a volume she is not supposed to possess, poems by a heretic philosopher, banned for questioning divine order. She reads slowly, the words unfamiliar but thrilling. Her pulse quickens. These are ideas not meant for her, thoughts forbidden to take root, yet they do. She hides the book beneath her pillow, its danger both terrifying and intoxicating. Elsewhere, Isabella stares at a page of scripture and sees meaning shift before her eyes. The words that once dictated obedience now suggest choice. She wonders if faith might be a conversation, not a command. But she says nothing. She closes the book gently, as though returning a secret to sleep. Outside, the world continues unaware. The kings hold councils, armies march, priests argue doctrine. But in the stillness of royal nurseries and study rooms, a quieter revolution is underway. The daughters of dynasties are learning how to think in silence. Their obedience becomes camouflage, their composure a form of control. The very tools meant to contain them, education, religion, refinement, are teaching them how to master themselves. As candlelight flickers across her face, Eleanor looks at her reflection in a small mirror. The girl who gazes back appears tranquil, but behind her eyes something unspoken gleams. The mind behind the smile has awakened, and though she will not speak yet, she understands something vital: the difference between silence and surrender. Night deepens. The corridors fall quiet, as if the entire palace sleeps under the same spell of restraint. But behind one closed door, a young princess reads by candlelight, her lips moving soundlessly over forbidden words. The flame trembles, throwing shadows across her face, shadows that look almost like wings. And so the education continues, shaping not just etiquette, but destiny. The daughters of silence are nearly ready for the next lesson, the one that will take place not in classrooms, but beneath crowns. The bells ring not for love, but for order. Their sound travels across courtyards and fields, announcing the union of two kingdoms more than the joining of two souls. The people cheer, the priests bless, the courtiers bow. Somewhere behind the silken incense, a young girl stands still in her gown, eyes wide but unmoving. She is not nervous, only emptied, prepared. For her, the ceremony has begun long before this day. Catherine of Aragon is 15 when she leaves Spain. The ship that carries her across the sea smells of salt and prayer. Her attendants whisper stories of England, how it reigns without mercy, how its court is colder than marble. Catherine listens and smiles politely, though her heart feels hollow. She carries with her trunks of gold, letters of alliance, and a portrait of the man she is to marry. She has studied his face more than her own reflection. The sea wind tears her veil, and the fabric flutters like a torn promise. When she steps onto English soil, trumpets play, but the sound feels distant, as if meant for someone else. Around her, men in fur-lined cloaks speak of treaties and peace. No one asks her what she wants. Her name, her language, her gods all, are to be softened, reshaped, anglicized. Her smiles are rehearsed diplomacy. Her silence, the currency that seals an empire. In Brittany, Anne is even younger when she learns that her future is not her own. Her childhood castle overlooks rolling green hills, but her lessons are about survival, not freedom. Tutors speak to her of duty, of how a woman's body can bind warring lands together. You are the key, they tell her. You will lock the door on bloodshed. She does not yet understand that keys are meant to turn both ways, that they can also be used to keep someone in. When she is married off to France, Anne's dowry includes not just jewels but her homeland's sovereignty. She smiles beside the king, her hands folded in devotion. Beneath her gloves, her palms tremble. At the feast, men toast to peace, their goblets raised high. But Anne sees only the space between their words, the absence of her own name in the agreements they praise. The treaty that bears her signature was never written for her. It was written through her. Mary Tudor's story is no softer. Born into opulence, she grows up surrounded by tapestries that depict love as legend, saints and heroes, brides and blessings. But she soon learns that in her world, affection is an echo of politics. Her father promises her hand to a man decades older. She stands beside him in the chapel, draped in white lace, and the crowd calls it destiny. Behind her veil, she closes her eyes, imagining her mother's face. For one fragile second, she wonders what would happen if she refused to speak the vows. The thought disappears like a spark in rain. The narrator's voice lowers, intimate and sorrowful. Each of these women knew the price of peace was personal. Their marriages were not entrances into love, but exits from selfhood. In the corridors of power, affection was dangerous, attachment inconvenient. They were expected to embody loyalty, to perform unity, to represent forgiveness. Every smile at a banquet, every graceful gesture at court, was a small rehearsal in the theatre of control. Letters from ambassadors reveal the truth behind the glitter. They describe Catherine's grace, Anne's composure, Mary's virtue. They never mention the loneliness. Yet in private notes and half-burned diaries, traces remain. Sentences cut short, phrases like, "I endure" and "I remain." These are not declarations of devotion, but confessions of survival. The narrator describes one such moment with quiet intensity. Catherine kneeling at her bedside, hands clasped, whispering in Spanish after a day spent pretending to be English. The candle flickers, and for a heartbeat she allows herself to weep. She wipes her tears quickly, ashamed not of sadness, but of being seen feeling it. Even emotion, she has learned, can be used against her. Anne of Brittany finds solace in her children, but even they are treated as symbols. Each birth is a political event, each death a diplomatic crisis. Her grief must be graceful, her mourning strategic. At the baptism of her third child, she stands beside the king, expression serene, even as her body aches from loss. The court praises her strength. They do not see that strength, for her, means silence. And Mary, in her gilded solitude, begins to fade beneath the weight of expectation. Portraits of her show a woman serene and luminous, but the eyes betray fatigue. She writes to a friend once just a single line that survives. They say the crown is heavy, they do not speak of the veil. The narrator pauses. The queen's silence was not submission, it was the last thing she could own. Within it lived all the things she could never say, the languages forgotten, the prayers unsanctioned, the homes abandoned. When diplomacy demanded she smile at her enemies, she smiled. When alliances shifted, she adapted. But inside that poise, there was a fracture widening, a quiet ache that no anthem could cover. Behind every royal procession, there were goodbyes unspoken. The mothers who watched their daughters sail away never knew if they would see them again. Letters took months, sometimes years, to arrive, and when they did, they were censored, translated, softened. A daughter's sorrow became a line of polite gratitude. A mother's longing became prayer. Whole lives reduced to decorum. The silence between those letters is the truest record of history. The narrator's tone turns reflective. In the eyes of the world, these unions were triumphs. But for the women who lived them, they were border crossings into exile. They became strangers in their own stories, renamed, repainted, rewritten to suit the language of diplomacy. Yet, in that stillness, something resilient endured. Even without words, they learned to influence the world that confined them. Through patience, through perception, through the unspoken art of endurance, they learned the delicate balance of surviving without vanishing. At every coronation, amid the chorus of blessings and applause, there is always a pause, the faint moment between vows and applause. In that pause, you can almost hear it, the sound of a young girl's heart adjusting to the rhythm of history. It is the sound of grace becoming armor. Centuries later, paintings will preserve their faces but not their voices. Historians will debate their influence, poets will romanticize their devotion, and yet the truth remains simpler, sadder. They were living treaties, their silence, the ink that sealed alliances. As the scene fades, the narrator's voice grows soft again. The bells that once celebrated their marriages now toll in memory. Catherine's patience becomes legend. Anne's composure becomes myth. Mary's sorrow becomes prayer. The world remembers the peace they purchased, but forgets the price they paid. The wind shifts outside a cathedral window. The candlelight bends. Somewhere beyond the reach of history, The young girls they once were still linger, waiting on the edge of oceans, clutching letters never sent. Their names echo through marble halls, but their voices are lost beneath the applause of men. And so, each royal wedding ends where it began, not in triumph, but in silence. The treaty holds, the kingdoms stand, but something immeasurable is gone. The narrator breathes the final line like a benediction. Every royal wedding was a peace treaty written in a woman's silence. The scene lingers on the last image. A bridal crown resting beside a candle, its jewels catching the dying light. The flame burns low, reflected in gold like a tiny sun about to set. Beyond it lies the next story, the world inside the palace walls, where obedience becomes theatre and survival becomes performance. The throne room gleams like a mirror. Every polished surface reflects not only the queen but the gaze of those who watch her. The hall is filled with courtiers dressed in silks that rustle like whispers. Their smiles are courteous, but their eyes are weapons. At the heart of this theatre stands Elizabeth of York, composed, radiant, motionless. Her stillness is mistaken for serenity, but it is calculation. Every movement is a line in an invisible script written long before she arrived. The Queen's life is performance, and the stage is endless. When she steps into the great hall, the sound of her footsteps dictates the rhythm of the court. When she sits, others follow. When she smiles, a kingdom exhales. But behind the calm poise lies an unspoken truth. In courts where words can turn to knives, control is measured not by what is said but by what is withheld. Elizabeth has learned this art too well. Her reign exists between glances. A raised eyebrow, a pause before reply, a breath held too long, these are her dialogues. She listens to men speak of war, marriage, and faith, all while pretending to be a listener and nothing more. Yet, within her quiet, she edits the future. She knows which word to omit, which silence to let linger until it grows heavy enough to bend decisions. In a world built on power, she rules by absence. Anne of Austria enters her own court centuries later under the same law of illusion. The French palace is a labyrinth of mirrors and secrets. Its corridors hum with intrigue, and even its candles seem to eavesdrop. Here, silence is not just prudence, it is survival. The Queen's every gesture is interpreted, every sigh recorded. If she walks too quickly, it suggests agitation. If she lingers too long, it implies desire. She learns to move like water, graceful, reflective, ungraspable. The narrator's voice glides softly, hypnotically. Queens did not simply live. They performed existence itself. Each day unfolds like a ritual. Morning audiences with ambassadors, where the wrong tone can ignite conflict. Dinners with courtiers, where the smallest jest might reveal allegiance. Even prayer must be staged, for piety itself is political currency. The throne, glittering beneath gold and velvet, is less a seat of power than a stage prop. Its purpose to hold her still while others act around her. And yet, within this stillness, a strange mastery emerges. Elizabeth learns that silence can be provocation, that the absence of a reply can unsettle men more than accusation. When foreign envoys press her for decisions, she lets them fill the silence with their own fears. The longer she waits, the more they reveal. What begins as obedience becomes strategy. Her silence becomes a mirror in which others see their ambitions reflected and begin to doubt them. Anne, too, discovers the same weapon. When courtiers question her loyalty, she answers with a gesture of calm so perfect it disarms suspicion. No words, no protest, only poise. Rumour dissolves against her composure because there is nothing to attack. She gives them no thread to pull, no crack to exploit. Her silence is not emptiness but armour, invisible and unyielding. The court mistakes this for meekness, but meekness cannot command rooms full of predators. Only precision can. Queens like Anne and Elizabeth learn to shape emotion like artisans, never showing more than necessary, never less than expected. Theirs is a choreography of control, each step rehearsed to conceal the mind behind the face. The narrator describes the world around them, a maze of etiquette and eyes. Courtiers bow too low, spies linger in tapestries, confessions are traded in coded compliments. The palace itself breathes gossip. Servants repeat what they hear, priests record what they sense. A misplaced glance becomes rumour by morning. A word murmured in kindness becomes treason by night. And so, The queen must navigate each day like a tightrope over water, silent, balanced, graceful, never falling. But even in performance, she remains human. Alone in her chambers, Elizabeth allows herself to breathe. The weight of stillness slips away for a moment. She studies her reflection in the polished silver mirror, not with vanity but with quiet disbelief. The woman in the glass looks composed, untouchable. The woman behind the gaze feels something else, a yearning for imperfection, for the freedom to falter. Yet she knows. A single crack in her facade would be enough to break the illusion, and the illusion is all that holds the world together. Anne, writing letters to trusted confidants, finds language again but cautiously. Her sentences are veiled in metaphor, her meaning buried beneath courtesy. "The lilies bloom early this year," she writes. Her allies know this means danger is near. Even friendship must be encoded. She cannot say what she thinks, she can only imply. And implication, she learns, travels faster than truth. The narrator pauses. The palace was never made for truth. It was made for reflection. Walls of mirrors multiply every image, every gesture, until even the queen cannot tell which version of herself the court believes in. Perhaps that is the point. The court worships illusion, and the queen becomes its living deity adored not for who she is, but for how well she conceals it. When foreign dignitaries arrive, Elizabeth greets them with a smile measured to the heartbeat. Her voice flows gently, like a stream over stones. She says nothing extraordinary, yet they leave believing they have been honoured. Later, her advisers praise her diplomacy, unaware that her restraint has prevented war. What they call passivity is, in truth, precision. Anne's restraint saves her in other ways. When accusations swirl of plots, of favouritism, of secret faith, she remains silent. The court grows restless, expecting denial, confession, outrage. None comes. Weeks later, her enemies tire of waiting. The silence outlives the scandal. There is power in stillness, but also loneliness. The queens know that to rule through silence is to vanish within it. Their voices fade from chronicles, their words replaced by interpretations written by men. Yet history remembers the calm. Centuries later, scholars describe them as graceful, patient, enigmatic. Few understand that grace was armor, patience a mask, and enigma a necessity. At night, the palace quiets. Candles burn low, tapestries sway in the draught. Elizabeth walks the corridor alone, her hand brushing the cold stone wall. She hears faint laughter from distant chambers, the echo of a court still performing even in darkness. She stops before a window overlooking the city. Below, thousands sleep, believing their queen rests in peace. But her peace is practiced, the same way her smiles are rehearsed. She wonders what it would feel like to speak a single unguarded word. The narrator's tone deepens, almost whispering. To be a queen was to be watched, and to be watched was to disappear. What remained of her was ceremony, the crown, the robe, the motion of grace repeated until it replaced identity. Yet within that repetition, meaning endured. Every bow, every silence, every polite refusal was a language understood only by those strong enough to listen differently. Elizabeth understood that silence could wound. It could outlast anger, outshine praise. It was both shield and sword. When her advisers urged her to respond to insult, she smiled instead. "Time," she said softly, "answers all things." The phrase spread like scripture, her calm mistaken for forgiveness. But time did not answer it, obeyed her. As dawn approaches, the palace begins to stir again. The stage resets. Servants draw curtains, courtiers prepare speeches, musicians tune strings. The queen will appear soon, perfectly dressed, perfectly poised. No one will see the thoughts that flickered in her mind hours before. No one will know that her silence is not emptiness, but memory, strategy, will. The narrator closes this chapter in a whisper of awe. In courts where every word could kill, silence became the sharpest weapon of all. The camera lingers on the throne one last time. The hall is empty now, yet the air still hums with her presence. The crown rests on its cushion, waiting. Beyond the gilded doors lie the private rooms, the chambers where performance ends, and the woman beneath the queen begins to breathe again. The corridors of the palace sleep, but one chamber glows with faint candlelight. The air smells of wax and parchment. the silence so deep it almost hums. A queen sits at her writing table, her hand hovering above the page. Outside her door, the guards pace symbols of loyalty and surveillance both. Inside, she begins to write. The pen scratches softly, a sound fragile enough to vanish if anyone listened too closely. Her words are not for history or for prayer, they are for herself. In a world where her voice is ceremony, the page becomes confession. Ink turns into breath. Each letter holds what she could never speak in council or chapel. The words arrive slowly, carefully, sometimes in French, sometimes Latin, sometimes in symbols of her own making. The candle trembles as if aware of the danger in what it witnesses. Marie Antoinette writes with restraint, though emotion leaks through her every phrase. Her letters to the Swedish Count Fersen, written during her imprisonment, carry neither plea nor weakness, only longing carefully disguised as etiquette. "Adieu, I live and die entirely yours," she signs one. The sentence concealed beneath a cipher of numbers and invisible ink. Each mark is rebellion disguised as grace. Every coded flourish is a small act of defiance against a world that silenced her. Catherine de' Medici's correspondence is colder, more deliberate. Her ink smells of iron and politics. Her letters move through hidden channels, delivered by riders who know when to disappear. Within her elegant script lies strategy, a second language of survival. She writes in riddles, leaving enough ambiguity to deny, enough precision to command. "The gardens must be tended," she notes in one message. Her council knows she speaks not of roses but of rivals. Elizabeth I's secret papers tell yet another story. Hidden within her private chambers were drafts of speeches never delivered, fragments of poems never signed. One page begins with a line, "If I speak, I am undone. If I do not, I am unseen." It ends abruptly, as if interrupted by footsteps. Her words, like her reign, exist between control and exposure. The queen who ruled through silence built her true kingdom in thought. The narrator's voice softens, drawing the listener closer. Imagine the sound of those pens, the faint rhythm of thought made tangible. In an age of spectacle, these quiet acts were revolutions. The written word became refuge, rebellion, and record all at once. For queens forbidden to confess, writing was not indulgence, it was necessity. The page listened when the world would not. Each letter carried risk. A misplaced courier, a curious servant, a rival intercepting a sealed note, any could unravel everything. So they wrote in codes, in metaphors, in half-phrases that only the intended could decipher. Marie hides affection within the language of diplomacy. Catherine hides commands within talk of faith. Their words became mirrors reflecting truth only when the right light fell upon them. But within that concealment, a strange kind of honesty bloomed. They wrote because silence demanded release. They wrote to remember themselves when the crown stripped identity away. They wrote to preserve emotion in a place untouched by ceremony. The candlelight around them became both companion and conspirator. In its flicker, the page glowed like a secret doorway, a threshold between duty and desire. The narrator lingers on a single moment, Marie's quill faltering as she hesitates over a word. Should she write love? The word itself is dangerous, political, almost treasonous. So she replaces it with a gesture, a symbol, a mark that only one man will understand. Her heart beats faster not because of romance, but because of risk. Even feeling must be encrypted. For Catherine, secrecy is not emotional but existential. Her power depends on perception, her safety on distance. Yet she writes constantly, as if her mind cannot rest without transcribing itself. The letters are both armor and confession thoughts too sharp to speak aloud. She uses ink as weapon, paper as battlefield. Her correspondences travel farther than her armies ever could. Elizabeth, alone in her study, writes in metaphors so layered that even modern historians struggle to decode them. She writes of storms and gardens, of mirrors and masks. Her words are prayers disguised as riddles, longing disguised as command. Perhaps even she no longer knows where the disguise ends. When she signs her initials ER, the letters gleam with authority, but the ink beneath trembles. The narrator's tone grows more intimate, as though leaning in to whisper, "These letters were never meant for us, and yet they survive." Each one carries the echo of a heartbeat too carefully hidden. Together, they reveal the paradox of confinement, that the tighter the chains, the sharper the mind becomes. Deprived of speech, these queens invented new languages of resistance. Their silence birthed eloquence, their restriction, depth. The act of writing itself was rebellion. In an era when words were property of kings and priests, to write privately was to reclaim a soul. The quill became confession booth, courtroom, diary, and sanctuary all at once. Beneath the rigid laws of obedience, these women practiced freedom, word by word, line by line. Outside the walls of their chambers, the world moved in noise parades, sermons, battles. Inside, time slowed. The queens wrote as if in trance, the candle shrinking with each page. The wax pooled like spilled thought. When they finished, they sealed the letters with trembling hands and pressed their rings into the wax symbols of power hiding the fragility of its owner. Some letters never reached their destinations. They were intercepted, confiscated, burned. Yet even in ash they spoke. Some were rediscovered centuries later, their ink faded but legible. Reading them feels like trespass, as though eavesdropping on the dead. Still, we lean closer. Because within those fragments lies something rare, authentic voice untouched by performance. The narrator breathes the question like a secret. What if the truest words of power were never spoken but hidden between lines of ink? The audience can almost see it now. A candle guttering as dawn approaches, the queen blowing gently to cool the wax. The letter is folded, sealed, hidden in a drawer behind rosaries and jewels. The guards outside never know what was created in their watchful silence. The crown that silenced her has, unknowingly, preserved her forever in ink. The camera of imagination drifts over time, the paper yellowing, the handwriting delicate, the words surviving wars, revolutions, fire. The queens vanish, but their private sentences remain whispering across centuries to anyone willing to listen. Their power was never in the throne, but in the thoughts they dared to write when no one was watching. The candle dies, leaving the room in shadow. Outside, morning begins. The palace will wake, and the queen will resume her role poised, controlled, radiant. No one will suspect that while they slept, she rebuilt herself in silence. Her secret voice now hides beneath every smile, every gesture, every law she signs. The world sees only grace, only the page remembers the truth. And so, within the hush of royal chambers, the written word becomes the last refuge of the unspeakable. Their ink carries both confession and defiance, soft as prayer, yet sharp as blade. In these secret voices, power does not shout, it breathes. As the narrator's voice fades, the camera seems to linger on a single page resting in darkness, the handwriting elegant and fragile. The ink shimmers faintly in the dying light, as if alive. The story waits there, unspoken but eternal, whispering to those who dare to read between the lines. The air in the palace is thick with perfume and suspicion. Behind the glitter of jewels and silk, words move like smoke, soft, shapeless, and deadly. Every whisper travels faster than truth. Every glance becomes an accusation waiting to be named. And at the center of this fragile web stands Anne Boleyn, young, sharp, and fearless enough to believe her voice might matter. For a moment, it does. Then the world reminds her that in a court built by men, a woman's voice is not a tool. It is a trap. The narrator's tone is calm, almost reverent, as if describing an execution that has not yet happened. She spoke 6 words too many, and they built her gallows from them. Those words were not commands or treason, not prophecy or confession. They were fragments of conversation, the kind that fill corridors and vanish in laughter. But here, nothing vanishes. Here, silence itself has ears. Anne's story begins as a triumph, a commoner's daughter who learns the grammar of power. She captivates the king not only with beauty but with language. She dares to answer him, to tease him, to challenge him. Her voice becomes her weapon, her wit sharper than any sword at court. But power loves novelty and fears it in equal measure. The same voice that seduces the crown begins to threaten it. In the echo of her laughter, men hear something dangerous, the sound of a woman unafraid. Rumour begins like a draft through a keyhole, silent, cold, unnoticed. Then it spreads. A lady in waiting repeats a private jest. A chamberlain adds embellishment. By the time the story reaches the council, it has grown teeth. The queen's words, harmless in intent, are recast as poison. What she said becomes less important than who repeats it. Truth no longer matters, only echo. The narrator draws the listener deeper into the slow rhythm of downfall. The court does not punish lies, it punishes noise. Silence has always been the law, but silence breeds hunger. In its absence, words multiply like mold in dark corners. Anne tries to command her story, to correct the distortions, but every defense becomes more evidence. To speak is to dig. To remain silent is to be buried alive. The tension grows like a pulse beneath the calm narration. The audience can almost hear the sound of whispers sliding along marble corridors, the faint rustle of parchment carrying accusations. The machinery of destruction turns quietly, methodically. The men who once adored her now speak of restoring order, of preserving honor. They claim righteousness while writing her death sentence in polite phrases. Anne stands before them, not as a queen, but as a symbol of what must never happen again. A woman who believed her own thoughts could matter in public. Her trial is theatre, her silence misunderstood as guilt. When she finally speaks, her words are measured, almost tender. She does not curse, does not beg. She speaks to the wind, to history, to anyone who might still be listening. But her words arrive too late. The decision has already been made not by truth, but by fear. The narrator pauses, voice lowering to a whisper. In the end, it was not what she said, but that she spoke at all. Her execution becomes the punctuation at the end of a sentence written by men who could not bear interruption. The scaffold waits beneath a pale sky. As she kneels, she prays not for mercy but for grace. Her lips move, soundless now. The crowd listens, straining for words that never come. The silence that follows is heavier than any speech. It spreads through the court like a shadow, reaching other queens who watch and learn. They understand the message. Silence protects, but it also suffocates. The thin line between survival and disappearance becomes clearer than ever. To live, they must erase themselves. To speak, they must die beautifully. Catherine Howard will learn the lesson soon after. Her laughter, her letters, her youth each twisted into crime. Marie Stuart too will meet the same silence, her words turned into threats by those who feared what she might confess. Over and over, the pattern repeats. Speech becomes scandal, curiosity becomes sin. The executioner's blade is always sharp, but rumour is sharper. The narrator's tone remains soft, hypnotic. In the courts of kings, words are currency, but only men are allowed to spend it freely. For women, every syllable carries weight. Too little, and they are deemed ignorant. Too much, and they are dangerous. The paradox is perfect in its cruelty. Obedience demands speechlessness, but influence demands speech. Caught between, the queen learns to craft silence, like glass, transparent yet unbreakable, beautiful yet cold. Still, there are moments when silence itself betrays them. When Anne's head falls, the sound echoes not as justice, but as warning. The court resumes its pageantry, its laughter, its polite politics. But beneath the music, something has changed. Every woman in the room feels it, even those who will never admit it. The air is different now. The price of a whisper has been named. The story widens beyond Anne, the narration drifting through time. The same rhythm of fear repeats across generations. Letters burned, diaries hidden, voices folded neatly into archives. Queens learn to leave messages in their absence. A glance, a pause, a delay. They communicate not with words, but with timing. Power now belongs to those who know when not to speak. But silence, once chosen, begins to shape the mind. It becomes habit, then identity. The queens who survive longest are those who master invisibility. They live long enough to watch history forget their thoughts and remember only their faces. Their portraits hang in galleries, serene and voiceless, the paint as smooth as their practiced expressions. The world calls them graceful. They know better. The narrator's voice turns almost sorrowful. Silence was never emptiness. It was full of fear, of thought, of everything that could not be said. Within that fullness, intelligence coiled itself like a secret waiting for air. Some queens used silence as shield, others as snare. They learned to draw enemies into speaking first, to let arrogance undo itself. Even within the cage, they found ways to control its door. Anne herself understood this too late. Her silence on the scaffold is both surrender and statement. In refusing to plead, she leaves her story unfinished. And unfinished stories live longer than complete ones. The legend of her voice outlasts the sound of it. In the centuries to come, her ghost is remembered not as the woman who lost her head, but as the one who dared to raise it. The narrator lets the quiet stretch, then continues with the weight of reflection. Truth was never the danger, audacity was. The truth could be ignored, rewritten, buried. But audacity, the courage to speak, to exist unsanctioned, frightened the world into violence. Each queen who followed learned to translate that fear into strategy. Their silence became a language more fluent than speech, spoken in gesture and restraint. And yet, beneath all the composure, something human remained: the desire to be heard. To leave behind not only lineage but voice. Some succeeded, others faded, but all knew the cost. The whisper that begins as defiance always ends as echo. The camera of the mind lingers on Anne one last time. Her body is gone, but her words, those scattered, half-remembered phrases, still circle the air of history. They haunt letters, poems, songs. They return each time a woman risks truth in a world that prefers silence. The cost remains, but so does the echo. As the narrator fades, the last image holds. A single quill left on a table beside a half-written letter, the ink drying mid-sentence. The window stands open, curtains stirring with wind. Somewhere beyond, the bells toll, not for justice, but for quiet. The silence that follows is not peace, it is memory. And it will spread far beyond the woman who first paid for it, shaping how nations listen, how power speaks, and how history decides who deserves to be heard. The council chamber glows with candlelight, a circle of faces half hidden in smoke. Men argue in low tones, voices tangled in ambition. At the far end of the table, Catherine de' Medici listens. She does not interrupt. She never needs to. Her silence is an instrument, tuned to tension. When she finally speaks, her voice is soft enough to draw the room closer, as if command itself requires quiet. The men nod, believing they have persuaded her, unaware that the decision had already been made before the meeting began. Power in her hands is invisible by design. It moves through gestures, pauses, and intermediaries. A letter sent through a trusted bishop. A rumour whispered into the ear of an advisor, who thinks it was his own idea. Catherine has learned that in a kingdom ruled by men, the only way to rule is to become the air they breathe unseen, indispensable, everywhere. The narrator's voice drifts like smoke through the candlelight. They called her obedient, but kingdoms moved when she raised an eyebrow. Catherine's courtiers think they are shaping France. In truth, they orbit her gravity. Even her children, kings themselves, rule under the weight of her quiet counsel. She wears mourning black long after her husband's death, a symbol of devotion, but the colour also shields her from scrutiny. While the court mourns with her, she governs in their blindness. Far from France, another queen bends silence into strength. Isabella of Castile sits in her private chapel, the scent of incense rising like thought. Her prayer sounds humble, but behind every word lies policy. She prays for unity and means empire. She prays for faith and means control. When she clasps her hands, the entire Spanish court takes it as a sign of piety. Only a few recognize the strategy behind it. Religion is her armor, devotion her diplomacy. In a world where women are allowed to rule only by divine permission, Isabella cloaks intellect in sanctity. The narrator slows the rhythm, letting the listener sink into the contrast. Piety as camouflage, reverence as resistance. Her silence was not submission, it was disguise. Each sermon she attends, each relic she blesses, strengthens her political pulse. Through the church she governs the conscience of her people. Through prayer she commands policy. Every amen conceals an order. Meanwhile, across centuries, Eleanor of Aquitaine writes letters that steer the fate of kingdoms. Her words travel farther than her armies, shaping alliances that will outlast her reign. To those around her she is courteous and composed. To those who read her letters, she is fire beneath silk. She speaks of family peace, meaning the dismantling of rivals, of duty, meaning ambition. Her couriers carry both parchment and prophecy. The camera of imagination moves between these queens, three faces of the same art: governance through invisibility, The narrator's tone is hushed, reverent, curious. They ruled without ruling, spoke without speaking, and left fingerprints on every law written in their names. Catherine's spies move through Paris like threads in her tapestry of control. They listen in taverns, churches, and corridors. What they hear returns to her, distilled into whispers. She weighs each rumour not for truth but for usefulness. To her, information is currency. Silence, the bank that holds it. Even her enemies underestimate her because she rarely appears to act. They forget that stillness is a form of movement too. In Castile, Isabella reads reports from explorers and priests. Their words are filled with discovery, faith, conquest. She understands the danger and promise of what they bring her. She blesses their journeys with solemn words, but her blessing is a leash, an invisible line connecting oceans back to her hand. The expansion of Spain is painted as divine destiny, yet every ship sails under the compass of her quiet ambition. Eleanor, older now, watches from her estates as her sons war over inheritance. The world calls her matriarch, history calls her patient, but patience, to her, is a weapon sharpened by time. She writes letters that travel between battlefields, words calibrated to divide or heal depending on who reads them. In her stillness, men mistake fatigue for forgiveness. They do not see the chessboard beneath her gaze. The narrator pauses, as if weighing the paradox. These women held the most fragile kind of power, the kind that must hide to survive. Their authority was not written into law but into perception. They ruled the one territory men could not conquer, the space between appearances and intention. At Catherine's court, the council meets again. The men talk over one another, voices swollen with certainty. She listens, her expression unreadable. Finally, she stands. The movement alone is enough to end debate. Her words are few, but final. A decree follows by nightfall, carrying her seal. By morning, her rivals will call it compromise. She calls it command. Isabella, too, masters the art of timing. When advisers question her alliance with Ferdinand, she smiles and says nothing. The silence stretches until it feels like rebuke. Later, when she finally speaks, her words sound like revelation. In truth, she has simply waited long enough for the question to collapse beneath its own doubt. Eleanor's method is different war through affection. She visits her rebellious son in prison, speaking softly, motherly. He believes her pity genuine. Days later, he signs a treaty that ends the conflict on her terms. Compassion, like silence, can be strategic. The narrator's tone becomes reflective, almost meditative. Influence without recognition, mastery without applause. These queens understood that power shown too clearly invites ruin. Their genius lay not in spectacle but in subtlety, in understanding that to endure, authority must appear accidental. They shaped nations not by decree but by suggestion. Yet even mastery has its solitude. Catherine's nights grow long. She sits by the fire surrounded by letters, every one a thread of her invisible web. She cannot sleep. The same silence that empowered her now isolates her. The court obeys her, but love has become ceremony. Her words move armies, but no one speaks her name without caution. Power that hides too well becomes its own prison. Isabella, near the end of her life, kneels again in prayer. The empire she built stretches beyond the horizon, yet she prays not for conquest, but for clarity. She has lived as symbol and strategist for so long that even faith feels political. The silence that once protected her now presses close, heavy, and holy. Eleanor outlives her sons, her husbands, her rivals. The courts she once ruled now speak her name with reverence and unease. She watches the world she built move without her, guided by habits she created. The silence she cultivated has outlasted her voice. The narrator lowers to a whisper. They called her obedient, but kingdoms moved when she raised an eyebrow. It is not a compliment, it is an epitaph. Their obedience was illusion, their submission, art. They did not steal power, they learned to breathe within it, to turn its weight into motion. The candlelight flickers over maps and letters, the last embers of a world ruled by quiet minds. Outside, bells toll, signalling the hour. Inside, nothing changes, because everything already has. And as the sound fades, the story prepares to shift again. From influence to defiance, from control to rebellion, from queens who ruled through silence to those who learned how to bend that silence until it finally broke. In a world addicted to motion, she becomes still. The court waits for her to speak, to decide, to react, but she does none of these things. Instead, Elizabeth I folds silence around herself like velvet. Her stillness is not absence, it is control. The men around her call it mystery, calling her the enigma of England. But what they mistake for grace is resistance. She has learned that the loudest defiance can come from doing nothing at all. The hall fills with voices clamouring for her attention. Advisers pressing for marriage, nobles demanding heirs, ambassadors awaiting response. Every request arrives wrapped in urgency. Yet Elizabeth listens without promise, her expression poised, her hands motionless. She knows that to answer is to surrender choice, so she turns uncertainty into a throne of its own. What if refusing to answer was the most dangerous answer of all? The narrator's voice slows, hypnotic, as the scene unfolds. Stillness as rebellion, silence as reign. Elizabeth's refusal to marry is the axis on which her empire turns. Every suitor, every envoy, every foreign king finds themselves caught in her quiet orbit, waiting for a yes that never arrives. With each moment she does not decide, her power grows. Her unmarried body becomes a political instrument, an open question the world cannot close. In this refusal, she transforms confinement into choice. Where her mother, Anne Boleyn, was destroyed by the danger of speaking, Elizabeth survives by the power of withholding. She weaponizes patience, understanding that uncertainty commands attention longer than certainty ever could. The Virgin Queen becomes both symbol and shield, untouchable, unknowable, and therefore undefeatable. The narrator invites the listener deeper into the psychology behind the myth. Her silence was not purity, it was strategy. In portraits, her pale face glows like the moon, emotionless and perfect. Around her neck, the heavy lace collar resembles armor disguised as lace. The courtiers who kneel before her see chastity. She feels freedom. Every unanswered question, every delayed decree, tightens her grip on authority. Power, she has learned, does not always belong to the one who commands it, belongs to the one who decides when to answer. But Elizabeth is not alone in this rebellion. Across centuries, other queens find ways to make stillness a form of strength. Catherine of Aragon kneels in prayer after being cast aside, her silence filling the courtroom with something heavier than argument. When she refuses to accept annulment, she does not shout. She simply kneels, head bowed, and the weight of her composure terrifies her judges. Her silence turns the chamber into a cathedral. Her dignity becomes a verdict no man can overturn. In Austria, Maria Theresa learns the same lesson. When her empire trembles, she does not make speeches. She appears before her soldiers carrying her infant son, wordless, her expression a mixture of courage and exhaustion. The image travels faster than any proclamation. Her silence becomes its own declaration of rule. In every age, the narrator observes, there are women who command by refusing to perform command. The music of the narration deepens low, steady, contemplative. Stillness is not surrender, it is stance. Elizabeth retreats often into private chambers, surrounded only by books, music, and the quiet hum of her own thought. The courtiers interpret her solitude as melancholy, but solitude is her weapon. The less she is seen, the more she is imagined. Mystery, she understands, is power's twin. What people cannot know, they cannot predict. There are nights when she sits before the fire, the glow soft against her face, and listens to the rain against the windows. She thinks of her mother, of the voice that once echoed too loudly in the same halls, and of the price of words. She wonders if silence too will one day betray her. But then she remembers, she has made it hers. She has turned silence into something that bends toward her will, rather than against it. The narrator lingers on this thought. In a world that demanded women serve as mirrors, she became the shadow instead. Shadows reveal shape without reflection. They define by obscuring. Elizabeth's stillness unsettles because it cannot be interpreted. Her advisers argue among themselves, projecting meaning onto her restraint. Every gesture becomes prophecy, every pause a negotiation. She governs not through decree, but through the fear of misreading her. There are times when she withdraws completely, vanishing from the public eye for weeks. The court panics, interpreting her absence as illness or omen. When she returns, calm and composed, the mere sight of her restores balance. Her invisibility has reminded them who truly holds the center. To disappear at will is a privilege of the powerful. The narrator compares her to a musician conducting silence between notes, a ruler of pauses rather than proclamations. The music of her reign lies not in sound but in timing. By holding silence long enough, she forces the world to listen harder. When she finally speaks, every word lands like a stone dropped into still water, ripples reaching far beyond the room. The rebellion of stillness does not roar. It hums like something ancient, steady, elemental. It is the same power found in saints who refuse to recant, in mystics who chose seclusion over spectacle, in mothers who raised empires from patience rather than conquest. It is not passivity, it is preservation, endurance, mastery. Yet even this mastery comes with loneliness. Elizabeth's stillness, once her shield, becomes her companion. The throne is vast, the nights longer than applause. She writes in her journals, though she never calls it that. "I have made myself marble," she notes once. The stone endures, but it feels no warmth. The narrator's voice softens. The price of refusing to play is to watch the game continue without you. In her later years, she moves slowly through the halls that once trembled at her silence. Courtiers still bow, but their whispers have changed, tone, admiration mixed with fatigue. The Virgin Queen's enigma has become legend, but legends, too, are cages. She knows it. Yet even as her body weakens, her will remains immovable. She refuses to name an heir until the very end, forcing her counsel into the same anxious patience she once mastered. Her last act of silence is her final lesson. Power lies not in what you give, but in what you withhold. The narrator draws the camera back. She had learned to rule not by speaking louder than men, but by making them lean in to hear her. Stillness, chosen and deliberate, has rewritten the nature of authority. Her reign becomes a study in paradox control through restraint, dominance through absence. She did not win by breaking rules. She won by becoming the one who defined when they applied. The candlelight dims around her portrait. The painted eyes still hold that same unreadable calm centuries later. Scholars debate her motives, poets praise her grace, but none can agree on who she truly was. That is her final victory. To remain unknowable is to remain unowned. The narrator's tone fades into near whisper. She turns silence into rebellion, and rebellion into rule. She made stillness speak louder than history itself. The final image settles softly. A crown resting on an empty chair, sunlight slanting through the window, dust drifting like quiet applause. Somewhere beyond the frame, footsteps echo the sound of generations who will inherit her lesson. Because once a woman learns to wield silence, the world can never quite silence her again. And from this hush, the story turns forward to those who followed her path, the daughters of restraint and the heirs of unspoken power. The past never really ends in palaces. It lingers in the air, like perfume that refuses to fade. Every corridor carries an echo. Every mirror remembers another face. The daughters who walk these halls are never alone. They move through the residue of their mothers' silences. What they inherit is not only crown or bloodline, but restraint, written into the rhythm of their breath. Eleanor's daughters are taught that words are currency too costly to spend. They learn from the stories whispered about her in dark corners, how she ruled with grace, how she endured with patience. What those whispers omit, the daughters understand instinctively, that grace was labour, and patience, disguise. Their tutors teach them history as if it were destiny, shaping them into continuations rather than beginnings. The lesson is gentle, but it cuts deep. To survive, they must become copies, improved perhaps, but never original. The narrator's tone softens, a kind of reverence in the hush. They inherited crowns, but what they really inherited was silence. The inheritance passes not through law or testament, but through tone. In how mothers speak to daughters before bedtime, in how queens brush their children's hair while reminding them never to speak too freely, in the pauses between caution and affection. "Smile, but never too much," the mothers murmur. "Listen, but never believe." The advice sounds tender, but it carries the weight of centuries. In Isabella's Spain, young princesses kneel beside their mother during prayer, watching her lips move but never daring to ask what she prays for. They imagine she is praying for their happiness. In truth, she prays for their endurance. The daughters sense this without understanding it. They learn to kneel perfectly still, to mimic devotion even when their minds drift elsewhere. The habit will follow them into adulthood, long after the prayers lose meaning. Centuries later, in France, Marie Antoinette grows up surrounded by the same invisible education. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, writes letters full of advice disguised as love. Do not speak too much. Men dislike clever women. Be charming, but never bold. Be loved, but never trusted. Each line is both a gift and a warning. The Empress's words reach across borders, across years, shaping a daughter she cannot protect. Marie reads the letters by candlelight, tracing her mother's handwriting as though it were a map back to safety, yet every instruction is also a cage. When she laughs too loudly at court, the whispers begin. When she speaks her mind, the gossip sharpens. Her mother's voice lingers in her ear. Do not give them reason. And so she begins to measure her tone, to smooth her laughter, to silence her instincts. It is the inheritance doing its work. The narrator lingers over the image of the letter, the ink faded, the paper soft at the edges. Advice becomes prophecy when it is obeyed too well. The daughters try to avoid their mother's mistakes, yet in doing so, they repeat them in new forms. Where their mothers spoke too softly, they do not speak at all. Where their mothers endured too long, they endure longer still. Silence multiplies, refined by love, reinforced by fear. In diaries never meant to be read, small cracks appear. One princess writes, "My mother told me silence keeps peace, but I have found it also keeps pain." Another confides, "I wonder what she might have said, had someone ever truly listened." The words feel fragile, like confessions scratched into glass. Yet they exist, proof that even the quietest women still found ways to leave traces. The camera of the mind drifts through time, one generation fading into the next. The rooms change, the languages shift, the dresses grow heavier or lighter, but the conversation never ends. Mothers teach daughters to endure, and daughters learn it so well that endurance becomes identity. To break the cycle would mean betraying the very women who taught them to survive. And so they carry the silence with devotion, mistaking its weight for loyalty. In portraits, the lineage is visible, not in features, but in expressions. The eyes of Marie Antoinette mirror those of Isabella, who mirrors Eleanor, who mirrors countless nameless queens before them. All share the same poised sadness, the same disciplined calm. The painter captures their beauty but misses the inheritance pulsing beneath it, a silence trained into grace. The narrator's tone deepens, threading empathy through tragedy. History remembers their names, but not their instructions. The etiquette manuals of their time read like hymns to invisibility. A lady must never contradict, nor appear learned, nor seem to lead. The words become scripture. By the 18th century, silence has become so natural to queens that even rebellion must disguise itself as composure. The inheritance has completed its evolution from survival tactic to tradition. And yet, within this continuity, the faintest resistance stirs. Some daughters begin to question without speaking. Their letters grow more reflective, their prayers more uncertain. In private, they wonder if obedience can coexist with honesty. A few dare to test it. One writes poems under a false name. Another hides her opinions inside the embroidery of altar cloths. These are not revolutions. They are small fractures, tiny openings through which air returns. The narrator imagines one such scene. A princess sitting at her writing desk, her mother's portrait hanging above her. The candle flickers between them, casting shadow over shadow. She picks up her quill, hesitates, then writes only one sentence. "I love her, but I must breathe differently." The ink dries slowly, a silent promise to herself. Perhaps this is how change begins, not with noise, but with the decision to inhale. Over centuries, this inherited quiet becomes something more complex. It is no longer only a rule, it is culture, identity, almost instinct. Whole societies built on decorum and dignity trace their manners back to these palaces. The silence of queens becomes the etiquette of nations. Even outside royalty, women learn to smile politely when wounded, to speak gently when angry, to disappear when too bright. The inheritance escapes bloodlines. It becomes civilization itself. The narrator lets the thought settle, reflective and tender. What began as survival became inheritance, and inheritance became nature. Each generation forgets who started it, believing the silence was always there. And in some ways, it was because silence, once taught long enough, feels like virtue. But beneath the calm, emotion pulses like an echo waiting to return. The daughters carry both love and loss for the women who raised them. They understand, too late, that the silence was never cruelty. It was protection, offered by those who had no other tool. It is history written in invisible ink, glowing only when looked at in candlelight. The scene closes with a single image. Marie Antoinette standing before a mirror, touching the pearl necklace her mother once wore. In her reflection, she sees not herself, but the lineage of quiet faces behind her. The pearls gleam softly, each one a secret, each one a voice never heard. She straightens her shoulders, the posture learned from centuries of training, and whispers into the empty room, "I understand now." The narrator's voice fades into stillness. They inherited crowns, but what they really inherited was silence. And as the last candle burns low, the story prepares to widen beyond queens and mothers and daughters to the empires, their silence sustained, and the worlds that grew accustomed to mistaking quiet for peace. In every age, the survival of a kingdom depends on noise, the clash of armies, the proclamations of kings, the applause of loyal subjects. Yet beneath the thunder of history lies another sound, quieter but enduring, the hush that keeps everything standing. It is the silence of queens, patient and deliberate, holding together what words might destroy. The narrator begins softly, like thought unfolding. Empires survived not because kings spoke, but because queens did not. The image shifts to a grand hall after council, the torches dim, the air thick with dust and incense. The men have left, their voices still echoing in corridors. The queen remains seated, hands folded, her expression unreadable. She says nothing, but the shape of her silence lingers in the room. Servants sense it. Advisors hesitate before leaving. The decision, though never spoken, has already been made. Catherine de' Medici knew this language well. In the fevered politics of 16th century France, words were dangerous currency. Her silence became statecraft containing rumours, softening tempers, delaying violence until she could redirect it. When religious wars threatened to split the kingdom, she smiled and said little, orchestrating marriages and truces as if diplomacy were a kind of prayer. Each time she refused to answer, tension dissolved just enough to buy another month of peace. The men around her thought her hesitant. She knew hesitation could hold a country together. In Spain, Isabella's restraint accomplished the same miracle on a grander scale. Her husband spoke in decrees. She governed in pauses. The Inquisition, the voyages, the expansion of empire all moved under the guise of divine unity. But it was her composure, her unwavering image of sanctity, that kept the machine from fracturing. The church called her blessed. History calls her formidable. Yet her power came not from command, but from the art of appearing eternal. Kings burned bright and fell. Queens like her endured by refusing to ignite. The narrator lets the idea settle. Silence, once viewed as weakness, became structure, the mortar between the stones of power. When kings raged, queens listened. When kingdoms trembled, they waited. In their restraint, the world found rhythm. Without that invisible equilibrium, crowns would have toppled faster, alliances would have snapped. Their quiet did not merely decorate power, it sustained it. The story drifts to England. Elizabeth of York, wife of Henry VII, rarely spoke in council, yet every noble knew her opinion mattered. Her presence softened rebellion before it began. Her silence reassured subjects that peace could last after decades of war. The stability of the Tudor line, so fragile in its first generation, rested as much on her calm as on her husband's sword. A single woman's refusal to disrupt the room became the foundation of a dynasty. The narrator's voice grows contemplative. Perhaps silence was the first architecture of empire, an invisible scaffolding holding up the spectacle of rule. Kings were visible symbols, queens were the unseen balance. When rulers spoke too boldly, it was queens who soothed the edges of history, who stitched the torn fabric of pride. Their stillness became tradition, and tradition over time hardened into necessity. But that necessity came with cost. For every empire built, a self was erased. The queens who mastered composure lost something they could never name a private voice, a simple truth, the right to feel without purpose. Their silence turned into inheritance, spreading through households and households until it shaped the entire temperament of nations. The virtue of quiet women became the cornerstone of civilization itself. The scene widens beyond courts. The narrator invites the audience to imagine silence as a force of governance, a current moving through generations. It tames chaos, smooths discourse, prevents revolt. Yet in doing so, it teaches conformity so deeply that even peace begins to resemble obedience. The empire's serenity rests on the suppression of sound. Eleanor's lineage shows how restraint becomes doctrine. Her descendants learned that mercy requires patience, and patience requires silence. Their letters speak in riddles of humility. Their portraits show serenity that borders on surrender. The world they inherited was orderly because it was wordless. And within that order grew the illusion that stillness equals virtue. At its height, this system functioned perfectly. The narrator conjures an image. A grand ball under vaulted ceilings, music floating through candlelight. The king laughs loudly. Courtiers applaud. At the edge of the scene, the queen smiles faintly, her hands unmoving. Everyone watches her. Her calm ensures that the chaos remains beautiful. She does nothing, and by doing nothing, she keeps the world intact. But the stillness that built empires also preserved their cracks, because silence, while stabilizing, collects pressure. For every conflict delayed, emotion accumulates in the quiet. Generations of unspoken grievances, forbidden thoughts, and unshed tears begin to hum beneath the marble floors. The narrator's voice lowers to a whisper. Stability is never peace. It is tension held beautifully still. In the letters of later queens, Marie Antoinette, Caroline of Brunswick, Charlotte of Mecklenburg, the language changes. There is fatigue in the politeness, irony in the humility. They still perform grace, but grace now feels rehearsed. The silence that once sustained monarchy now begins to suffocate it. When the people rise, when revolutions ignite, the quiet composure of queens becomes evidence of their distance, their irrelevance. The same calm that once inspired devotion now provokes rage. The paradox is cruel. What once held the empire steady now marks it as unfeeling. The restraint that saved kingdoms for centuries cannot save them from change. The narrator muses. The architecture of silence was flawless, until history demanded a voice. Catherine's patience gave France decades of fragile balance, yet when her descendants faltered, the silence she taught them became paralysis. Isabella's empire grew vast, but the devotion she modelled hardened into dogma that consumed itself. Elizabeth of York's serenity birthed a dynasty, but it also birthed expectation that queens should endure endlessly, even when endurance meant disappearance. The camera of imagination sweeps across time. Palaces turned museums, thrones empty beneath chandeliers, portraits staring out through centuries of quiet. The world they built still stands, but their voices are gone. The marble columns, the ceremonies, the laws all echo with the hush that once held them in place. Even now, modern nations still carry traces of their restraint decorum in diplomacy, ritual in politics, civility masking control. The architecture remains, even if the architects are forgotten. The narrator allows a pause, contemplative and almost mournful. What if silence was never virtue, but sacrifice mistaken for wisdom? The queens of history did not merely choose restraint, they were chosen by it. Their stillness prevented collapse, yet erased individuality. To hold the world together, they had to let go of themselves. The tone deepens, reflective. They were the pulse beneath the noise, the pause between history's sentences. Without them, kings would have burned faster, wars would have widened, revolutions might have come sooner. Their silence delayed chaos long enough for civilization to write its myths. But the myths, like the walls they upheld, could not last forever. As candlelight fades in the palace corridors, the narrator concludes softly. Empires survived not because kings spoke, but because queens did not. The silence that built the world is still with us in diplomacy, in decorum, in every pause before truth is spoken aloud. But even the strongest mortar eventually cracks when the pressure beneath becomes too great. The sound that follows is almost imperceptible, the faintest shift, like stone under strain. The silence that once supported everything begins to tremble. The story is ready to move forward to the moment when the first fissure appears, when stillness can no longer contain the weight it carries. The 18th century dawns like a slow awakening. Across Europe, the air changes lighter, questioning, full of talk that once would have been treason. Philosophers write of liberty, reason, and equality, their words drifting through salons and drawing rooms like sparks in candlelight. Yet in the high palaces where queens still reign, the old language of obedience lingers. Between them, tension hums a whisper that will soon become thunder. The narrator's tone is calm but weighted, like the stillness before rain. They learn to speak at last, just as the world learned to punish speech. The women who once held kingdoms together with silence now stand at the edge of a new age, uncertain whether their inherited restraint will save them or doom them. Marie Antoinette stands among them, young, radiant, unprepared for the world that waits beyond Versailles. She has been taught grace, not politics, charm, not defense. But something restless lives beneath her composure. The Enlightenment's language of freedom reaches even the golden walls of her court. At masked balls and musical salons, she hears ideas that unsettle her. The thought that a monarch's power might rest not on divine right but on consent. She listens, curious, unguarded. For the first time, she begins to believe that silence may no longer protect her. Outside, the world listens too. Every gesture she makes becomes rumour. Her laughter is arrogance, her fashion a scandal, her generosity a trick. The same charm that once enchanted Europe now condemns her. When she speaks, her words are twisted by pamphlets and gossip into proof of decadence. The Queen, who once performed stillness, now faces judgment for being too alive. The narrator lingers on her image. The powdered hair, the painted smile, the eyes that see too clearly. She inherits centuries of silence and dares to fill it with laughter. But laughter, in this new world, is noise the people will not forgive. The revolution brewing outside her gates is not only political, it is moral, personal. A world that once demanded queens be silent now demands they disappear entirely. Far to the east, another woman bends the rules differently. Catherine the Great of Russia does not wait for permission to speak. She writes manifestos, letters, treatises. Her court becomes a beacon of intellect, filled with philosophers and artists. Yet her brilliance terrifies as much as it inspires. The men who once admired her pen now whisper about her ambition. They call her dangerous, unnatural, unfeminine. The very act of thought becomes rebellion. The narrator's voice lowers, reflective. In every age, a woman's mind is praised until it begins to move without permission. Catherine understands this. Her letters to Voltaire, full of wit and argument, are both conversation and camouflage. She knows that to rule as a woman requires the illusion of agreement, even when she secretly disagrees. But ideas, once released, have their own momentum. They travel faster than thrones can control. Even Catherine cannot command what her curiosity unleashes. In England, Queen Caroline walks the same fragile line. Intelligent, outspoken, beloved for her humour, she hosts philosophers and reformers who see her as a bridge between court and common thought. She laughs too freely, speaks too boldly, challenges too openly. The king endures her brilliance until it overshadows his own. Then admiration curdles into resentment. The courtiers, once delighted by her wit, begin to whisper the old accusation. Impropriety. In a man, her wit would be admired. In a queen, it becomes scandal. The narrator weaves their stories together, like threads of the same tapestry, each woman a flicker of rebellion blooming too late. The world had changed, but the rules had not. Their courage reveals the contradiction of their age. Freedom celebrated in books, punished in bodies. The Enlightenment speaks of equality, yet queens still pay for thought with exile, slander, or death. The candlelight in the story burns lower, the tone deepens. History moves forward, but power never forgets its fears. For centuries, silence had preserved empires. Now, speech threatens to shatter them. The queens who try to bridge that divide are caught between centuries too modern for their time, too royal for revolution. Marie Antoinette begins to feel the tension physically, the hum of discontent in the crowd, the weight of pamphlets that paint her as monster and martyr both. She writes letters to her family in Austria, filled with confusion more than fear. "I meant only joy," she writes once, "but they call it pride." Her words are tender, human, unguarded. The very things that make her real are used to prove she is unfit to reign. Catherine, meanwhile, grows surrounded by contradiction. The philosophers she nurtures praise liberty, but question her autocracy. Her own nobles resent the equality she pretends to admire. She rules vast lands, with reason on her lips and power in her hands, knowing that if she falters for even a moment, she will be remembered not for brilliance but for her gender. Her silence, once chosen, begins to return. She stops answering letters, withdraws from debate. The first crack of doubt echoes inside her empire. And Caroline, whose laughter once filled the English court, finds herself slowly erased. Her husband's anger turns public. The nation chooses sides. The newspapers devour her image, stripping it into caricature. The queen who dared to speak becomes spectacle. When she dies, some say the bells that should have rung for mourning are drowned out by church silence, her rebellion ending not in scandal, but in absence. The narrator pauses, and the quiet feels heavy. They had learned to speak at last, just as the world learned to punish speech. Their courage did not fail, it was simply misread. To question in an age that celebrates reason is to become reason's sacrifice. The Enlightenment promised light, but the first thing light reveals is shadow. The music beneath the narration shifts calm, but darker now. Like candlelight before a storm, the listener can feel the inevitability building. The old structure of silence that once held empires steady begins to fracture, not through revolt alone, but through the strain of voices long withheld. The queens who dared to speak do not destroy their world, they expose its weakness. The narrator's voice becomes almost meditative, drawing the thread through centuries. Every civilization begins with silence and ends when it forgets why it was silent. The queens of this age are neither saints nor sinners. They are bridges made of flesh and thought, carrying the weight of transition. Their failures are not moral, but mechanical, the inevitable breaking of a system that has demanded stillness for too long. As the scene closes, the camera of the mind moves through corridors, once filled with laughter. Portraits of queens seem to watch, aware of what is coming. The walls that have contained secrets for centuries begin to tremble with a sound like distant thunder, the murmuring of crowds outside the palace gates. The last image lingers on Marie Antoinette, standing at a balcony, her hands resting on the rail as if listening to a future she cannot yet see. The crowd below is faceless, restless, waiting. The wind lifts her hair, carrying her words away before she can speak them. For a moment she looks almost serene, as if she understands that history will finally hear her, not in voice, but in echo. The narrator's tone softens to a near whisper. The first cracks have opened. The silence that built the world begins to remember its weight. Beyond those walls, revolutions stir, myths unravel, and the age of quiet obedience draws its final breath. The story turns toward its next act, the collapse of queens and the legends that will rise from their ruins. The sound of the crowd is no longer applause, it is hunger. The air that once shimmered with the music of court now vibrates with chants and the metallic rhythm of marching boots. Curtains are torn down, portraits defaced, symbols of monarchy dragged into daylight. What was sacred becomes spectacle. The age of whispers collapses into noise. The narrator's voice is low, almost mournful. History silenced them, but their quiet still echoes louder than any king's decree. The queens who once ruled by restraint now face judgment, not for what they did, but for what they represented. The world that demanded their silence now condemns them for having kept it. Marie Antoinette walks through a hall stripped of its mirrors. The chandeliers are gone, the air thick with dust. She moves slowly, neither regal nor broken, simply human. The guards do not bow, they stare. Each step toward the guillotine is both ritual and release. The city outside hums with fevered excitement, a collective exhale after centuries of restraint. For them, her silence has become unbearable. It must end in sound. The narrator does not linger on violence, only on atmosphere. The cobblestones glisten with rain. The crowd murmurs like a sea before storm. When the blade falls, the moment is strangely quiet, as if even history holds its breath. That silence becomes her final gift to the world, the hush that follows all endings, the pause before myth begins. Catherine the Great dies in her palace years later, far from mobs and guillotines, but her silence takes a different shape. Her enemies rewrite her into caricature, a woman too powerful, too ambitious, too knowing. The intellect that once dazzled Europe becomes her indictment. In death she cannot defend herself. Her letters are edited, her words misquoted, her motives softened or stained depending on who holds the pen. The Empress becomes story, the story becomes warning. The narrator's tone softens into reflection. Every fallen queen becomes literature. Their quiet is repackaged into morality tales, their choices recast as lessons for those who follow. The same world that punished their voices now immortalizes them for their restraint. History, it seems, cannot bear silence, unless it can control its meaning. Queen Caroline's memory, too, is rewritten. The woman who laughed too freely becomes a symbol of disgrace. Pamphlets mock her. Artists exaggerate her features. The public devours her downfall like theatre. Yet behind the ridicule, a strange affection lingers. Pity for her honesty. Admiration for her refusal to vanish completely. Even in disgrace, she will not go quietly. She dies exiled from the court that once cheered her, but the people remember her name long after her king's fades. The narrator moves gently between these stories, like walking through a ruined gallery. The silence has changed shape it no longer protects, it remembers. In the absence of their voices, the world begins to speak for them. Historians interpret, poets romanticize, painters restore the serenity that life never granted them. Their faces reappear in frescoes and biographies, eyes lifted as if gazing toward a heaven that owes them explanation. But the letters, the true remnants of who they were, tell a different story. Torn, burned, smuggled, rewritten. Fragments survive in archives, edges singed, ink faded. A half sentence from Marie Antoinette. I forgive. A line from Catherine. Reason must be tempered with mercy. Another from Caroline. They shall not teach me silence again. These are the last breaths of human thought before history's rewriting. The camera of the mind imagines these fragments scattered by wind pages torn from diaries, ink dissolving in rain, words dissolving into myth. The narrator lingers. The wind carries what the crown could not protect. Each fragment, weightless, becomes part of something larger, an echo moving through centuries, reshaping itself into legend. The tone deepens, meditative. Every empire ends twice, once in the fall of its walls, and once in the forgetting of its voices. Yet forgetting, too, is never complete. The silence left behind by these women becomes foundation for a new mythology. The tragic queen, the sainted prisoner, the misunderstood mother of a broken age. The world cannot resurrect them, so it sanctifies their absence. The image shifts again to the libraries where their names now rest on gilded spines, to portraits restored under careful light. The queens have become safe at last, enclosed in art, their pain translated into beauty. Yet even in preservation, distortion persists. Their faces are serene because the world demands serenity. The rage, the wit, the longing all vanish beneath varnish. They are silent again, but this time forever. The narrator breathes the line like prayer. It is easier to worship silence than to understand it. That is how history absolves itself by mistaking erasure for peace. But if one listens closely, beneath the calm surfaces of museums and textbooks, something still murmurs. The silence of the queens never truly died. It adapted. It became the quiet undercurrent of civilization, the instinct to bow one's head, to measure one's words, to mistake endurance for virtue. Their stories live not in the noise of revolutions, but in the pauses that follow. In that way, their silence remains undefeated. Even kings' decrees, written in fire and conquest, fade sooner than their restraint. The narrator recalls the opening truth of this saga. Empires were built on their quiet. Now, even in ruin, it endures. The hush that once stabilized crowns now steadies remembrance itself. The story slows. The narrator's voice turns almost to a whisper, as if standing amid the remnants of Versailles or the broken stones of a Russian courtyard. The wind moves faintly through empty chambers, lifting dust like breath. It sounds almost like pages turning. Silence is never absence. It is survival transfigured. Marie Antoinette's last prayer, Catherine's final command, Caroline's final laugh, all dissolved into myth, yet myth keeps them alive. The listener can almost see their shadows walking the corridors of memory, not as ghosts but as ideas. The power of restraint, the cost of grace, the echo of defiance. For centuries, men have written their endings, but endings are not the same as silence. The Queen's quiet is still moving, still shaping thought, still present wherever dignity is mistaken for consent. Their stories whisper through time. We are not gone. We are listening. The narrator concludes softly, with reverence and finality. History silenced them, but their quiet still echoes louder than any king's decree. A candle flickers out. The scene fades into the hush that follows. Execution, exile, rumour, remembrance. The world is different now, its rulers replaced, its palaces emptied, but the echo remains, steady as breath. And in that echo lies a question. If silence built the world, what will rebuild it when silence is gone? The story waits, suspended between endings and beginnings, the final breath of one age and the first inhale of another. The silence holds. Centuries pass, and the queens who once ruled, suffered, and fell begin their second lives not in flesh, but in story. The palaces that confined them crumble into monuments. The rooms they once walked become museums. Their names, once spoken in fear or reverence, now drift through art, theatre, and poetry, shaped not by memory, but by imagination. In this new existence, they are not women, they are symbols. The narrator's voice is calm, deliberate, tinged with melancholy. They were remembered for their silence, but never for what it cost them. The transformation begins quietly, like all forms of erasure do. The details of their real lives fade, the sound of their voices, the nuance of their choices, the small daily rebellions that made them human. What remains is an outline, a gesture. Into that outline, centuries of storytellers pour their own meaning. Pain becomes piety, defiance becomes sin, silence becomes virtue. The portraits come first, grand canvases, painted by men who never heard the women speak. Their brushes translate silence into serenity. Marie Antoinette, once mocked for her extravagance, now appears ethereal, tragic, calm. The light falls tenderly across her face, softening the memory of the guillotine. In Catherine de' Medici's portraits, the sharpness of her intelligence becomes maternal benevolence. Her letters of strategy and survival are forgotten. Her image now belongs to devotion. The queens who once wielded silence as power are recast as paragons of modesty. The narrator describes one painting in particular. A queen seated near a window, her eyes lifted toward heaven, hands folded, expression divine. The painter calls it grace under trial, but there is no hint of fatigue, no trace of the fear that once lived beneath that posture. The real woman is gone. What remains is the comfort of distance, the illusion that her suffering was chosen, her silence willing. Then come the plays and poems. Shakespeare turns queens into emblems of temptation and tragedy. Cleopatra as passion unbound, Lady Macbeth as ambition's shadow. Centuries later, romantic poets resurrect the same pattern, crafting heroines who die beautifully, who whisper rather than speak, who wait rather than act. Even Rebellion is rewritten to fit the comfort of male imagination. The queen's real restraint, once weapon, once survival, is now moralized into weakness or sanctity. The narrator's tone becomes analytical but intimate. Art does not lie, it simplifies. And in simplification, truth fractures. Each retelling polishes away the inconvenient edges. The queens become what the culture needs them to be. Saints in times of chaos, warnings in times of freedom, fantasies in times of boredom. Their silence becomes a mirror for the anxieties of each age. In Victorian England, silence is recast as grace. Poets and painters adore the angel in the palace, her composure seen as evidence of divine femininity. The quiet queen becomes the moral compass of empire, proof that restraint sustains civilization. Yet behind this ideal lies erasure, the refusal to remember that silence, for these women, was not chosen but required. The myth of the obedient queen becomes justification for every obedient wife, every voiceless woman who follows. The narrator pauses, contemplative. History always rewards the quiet after it kills the noise. The more these queens are sanctified, the more they are stripped of identity. The act of remembering becomes another form of forgetting. To canonize is to confine. Even rebellion is aestheticized. Marie Antoinette's laughter, once political crime, becomes fashionable in hindsight. Her downfall is recast as tragedy rather than execution, her errors softened into elegance. She becomes the eternal ingenue, too innocent to survive, too beautiful to blame. The real complexity of her mind, her letters of worry, her late attempts at reform vanish behind the myth of doomed grace. Catherine the Great suffers the opposite distortion. Where Marie becomes too pure, Catherine becomes too impure. Her intellect and authority, threatening to patriarchal history, are repainted as excess, sensuality, indulgence. The empress who wrote laws and patronized philosophers becomes caricatured as lover and tyrant. Power in a woman's hands, once feared, now survives only as spectacle. The narrator's tone sharpens, though it remains calm. This is how patriarchy preserves its legends. It rewrites power as morality, and morality as beauty. The Queen's silence is not only romanticized, it is weaponized, turned into evidence that women should remain still, serene, and unseen. The art that memorializes them becomes instruction, teaching new generations that endurance is elegance, that speech ruins perfection. In galleries and textbooks, the myth grows comfortable. Viewers stand before portraits of Elizabeth I, admiring her restraint, her enigmatic poise, her divine solitude. They rarely ask what loneliness looks like beneath the paint. They see the symbol of empire, not the woman who spent her life performing composure until it became her only self. The Virgin Queen, eternal and untouchable, becomes the model of strength that requires erasure to exist. The narrator lowers their voice, almost whispering. Every portrait of a queen is a negotiation between admiration and control. We remember them as faces, not voices. We gaze, but we do not listen. Their silence comforts us because it asks nothing. Yet beneath every painting, every poem, every polished myth, something restless remains. A flicker of dissonance in the brushstroke, a hint of resistance in the eyes. The queens, even as symbols, still refuse complete surrender. The artist paints serenity, but the gaze betrays something else, a secret that cannot be translated. That is how truth survives inside distortion. Through the imperfections art cannot erase. The narrator lingers on this paradox. Myth imprisons, but it also preserves. Without distortion, these women might have vanished entirely. Through it, they endure, though transformed beyond recognition. History cannot remember them honestly, yet it cannot forget them either. Their silence, once punishment, then protection, becomes immortality. And so, across centuries, they move from throne to legend to icon. Their images hang in museums, their names whispered in theatres, their likeness printed on coins. But the cost of immortality is identity. The women are gone, the symbols remain. The narrator's tone softens again, almost elegiac. They were remembered for their silence, but never for what it cost them. Their restraint, their endurance, their composure, all qualities once forged in necessity, become virtues that erase the reasons they existed at all. The audience is left to question, how many myths began as misunderstandings? How many saints were simply survivors? And how many martyrs were silenced by beauty itself? The scene closes in a gallery, candlelight flickering against the frames of portraits. The queens stare outward, eternal, immaculate, unknowable. The floor creaks faintly beneath invisible footsteps, perhaps the ghosts of their real selves, pacing behind the paint. The narrator's voice fades, slow and deliberate. They are no longer women, they are mirrors, reflecting what the world wishes to believe about them. But behind every reflection waits a shadow, still alive, still waiting to be seen. From here, the story moves toward recovery, to peel back the varnish of centuries, to find the women hidden inside the myths, and to listen, at last, for what they might still be trying to say. The story begins not in a palace, but in a library. Dust floats in shafts of pale light. The room is silent, but not empty. It hums with the quiet weight of memory. Here, the past sleeps in boxes bound by string, in letters folded and forgotten, in handwriting so faint it seems to whisper as you read. This is where the queens return, not as saints or martyrs or myths, but as writers, thinkers, and women who once dared to record themselves. The narrator's tone is hushed, reverent, as if entering a sacred chamber. They were never voiceless. The silence belonged to us. For centuries, their words lay buried beneath layers of misinterpretation, censored, dismissed, or reworded by men who preferred symbols to speech. Now, under the patient eyes of historians, their sentences breathe again. The ink may have faded, but the intention has not. A historian unfolds a letter written by Catherine de' Medici, The parchment trembles slightly in her hands, as though alive. The words, written in careful French, reveal not manipulation or cruelty, but exhaustion and clarity. They think me cold. I am only weary of fire. That single line dismantles centuries of accusation. Catherine, long painted as a schemer, emerges as a strategist, trapped between chaos and necessity. A woman who kept peace, not because she wanted power, but because she feared its cost. Another box holds fragments of Marie Antoinette's prison correspondence. The handwriting is uneven, her sentences shorter than before. She writes of her children, of the sound of bells she still hears in her dreams. One line, barely legible, stops the historian's breath. Tell them I tried to understand them. It is not an apology, nor defiance. It is comprehension, the voice of a woman who, in her final days, saw humanity on both sides of the scaffold. The narrator moves softly between these rediscoveries, the voice low, deliberate. Every recovered word is an exhale centuries late. In the margins of these letters, in the edits and crossings out, the listener can feel the rhythm of thought, the pulse of intelligence denied expression. The archive becomes a kind of resurrection, queens speaking again, not to defend themselves, but to be seen whole. From England comes a small miracle, a collection of drafts written by Elizabeth I in her own hand, preserved by chance. Among them is a speech she never gave, one that begins, "They think a woman's heart cannot bear the weight of crown or war, yet it is women who bear nations themselves." The ink fades halfway through, but the message remains. The queen who spent her life performing composure reveals a rare truth. She knew the myth surrounding her, and she sustained it knowingly, painfully, for survival. The narrator pauses to let the listener feel the weight of this discovery. They were never truly silent. We simply never learned how to hear them. Feminist historians begin to reassemble what patriarchy dismantled. Across archives in Paris, Madrid, Vienna, and London, scholars trace voices once scattered like ashes. They find marginalia notes written in books queens read, poems composed in secret, small personal confessions buried inside devotional texts. Catherine of Aragon leaves a prayer rewritten in her own words, her Latin sharper than any sermon. Isabella writes about trade, science, and faith with more logic than her confessors. Eleanor of Aquitaine drafts letters of political negotiation disguised as family correspondence. Each discovery feels intimate, alive. The narrator describes the sensation. Reading these words is like hearing someone breathe through stone. The queens emerge not as myths, but as minds complex, flawed, feeling. They laugh, mourn, doubt, argue. Their humanity is startling in its ordinariness. For centuries, their silence made them seem distant. Their words bring them close. In one archive, a scholar finds an unsigned poem, written in a feminine hand, dated to the reign of Henry VIII. The language is tender but defiant. They call it virtue when we bleed, and sin when we survive. There is no record of its author. It might have been written by a lady in waiting, or by a queen herself. But it belongs to all of them, the distilled voice of generations denied expression. The narrator's voice deepens, almost trembling with awe. We were taught that silence defined them, yet their words never stopped speaking, they only changed rooms. Letters moved in secret, poetry disguised itself in prayer, philosophy hid inside etiquette. The world refused to hear, so they found other ways to speak. The scene shifts back to the modern era. A museum exhibit displays the recovered letters behind glass, softly lit, each one labelled with the name of its author. Visitors walk quietly, reading the words that history once erased. Some pause longer than others, drawn to a phrase that feels too familiar. A young woman presses her hand to the glass, whispering the lines under her breath. The queens have found their audience at last. The narrator's tone turns contemplative. When we listen now, we do not only hear their voices, we hear ourselves learning to listen. The silence we inherited was never theirs. It was a reflection of our deafness. Every rediscovered letter becomes a confession of collective neglect, a reminder that history's true tragedy is not loss, but the refusal to notice what was always there. As the pages unfold, so do the women. Marie's wit gleams between lines of sorrow. Catherine's letters reveal diplomacy disguised as poetry. Elizabeth's speeches shimmer with ironic humour, the kind born of exhaustion. Even their contradictions feel deliberate proof of minds aware that they were being watched, edited, remembered, before they were even gone. The narrator leans closer, voice softening to a near whisper. Archives are not tombs, they are lungs. When the letters are opened, history breathes again. The air of centuries trapped in those boxes carries not dust, but the quiet pulse of thought refusing extinction. A final image forms, a scholar sitting alone at night, the only sound the turning of fragile pages. The candle beside her trembles. She reads aloud one last fragment, Marie Antoinette again, written in the days before her death. They think me quiet. I am only listening. The scholar closes her eyes, overwhelmed by the simplicity of it. Listening, after all, was always their strength. The discipline turned art. The art turned survival. The narrator's tone becomes both mournful and luminous. They were never voiceless. The silence belonged to us. For centuries, the world demanded their restraint, then misread it as emptiness. Now, at last, their words remind us that silence was not absence, it was endurance. Every letter, every confession, every prayer unearths a truth too long buried, that history's quietest figures were its keenest observers. The story slows into reflection. The queens no longer feel distant, they feel near, familiar, almost contemporary. Their words reach across time not as ghosts but as companions, reminding us that even erased voices have ways of returning. The silence that once sustained empires now sustains empathy. The final lines fall like breath. They were never truly silent. They were waiting. And in the rustle of old paper, they are speaking still. The candlelight fades. The sound of pages turning becomes the pulse of history itself, soft but steady, echoing into the next chapter, the reckoning of what their silence, and our rediscovery of it, truly means. The candlelight of history fades, and a quieter illumination begins, the kind that does not reveal palaces or portraits, but mirrors. The queens are gone, yet their patterns remain. The rituals of silence they perfected did not vanish with their crowns. They simply changed costume. They live now in conference rooms and dinner tables, in the pauses before someone disagrees, in the smile offered instead of resistance. The narrator's voice is calm, reflective, modern yet timeless. The age of queens ended, but their silence lives quietly inside us all. Every generation believes it has escaped the old systems. Yet when a meeting ends and the one with the least authority stays quiet, though they have the clearest thought, something ancient stirs. When a child learns to measure their words by the temperature of a parent's mood, the same conditioning breathes again. The lessons taught to royal daughters: smile, but never too much. Listen, but never believe, have become invisible habits of survival. The stage has changed, but the play continues. Psychologists call it social conditioning. Historians call it hierarchy. But it feels simpler than either just the soft instinct to stay safe by staying silent. It is the same instinct that once protected queens from execution, now protecting employees from demotion, families from confrontation, friendships from truth. The currency of survival remains the same: composure, compliance, the appearance of harmony. The silence that built empires now keeps boardrooms running smoothly, marriages polite, societies stable. The narrator's tone deepens, meditative. We learn early that words have weight, and that weight can crush. The child who learns not to contradict a parent grows into the adult who hesitates before questioning a superior. The student who discovers that curiosity invites mockery becomes the citizen who lets injustice slide. Silence, once imposed from above, becomes internalized, a reflex disguised as grace. This is the psychology of obedience. Fear softened into manners. The queens lived it as performance, but the performance outlived them. It became culture, passed down not through blood but through expectation. We inherit it the way we inherit language without remembering when we first learned it. We tell ourselves it is civility, professionalism, respect. Yet beneath those words lies something older: the desire to survive by not disrupting the order of things. The narrator describes a modern scene. A woman in an office listens as others speak over her ideas, then repeat them as their own. She smiles, nods, lets it pass. She is not submissive, she is strategic. She knows that interruption can end a career faster than incompetence. Later that night she lies awake, replaying the silence she performed and wondering whether it was strength or fear. History would recognize her. So would Catherine, Elizabeth, Isabella. The setting has changed, but the silence feels the same. Another image forms. A man in a meeting senses wrongdoing but says nothing. His voice catches on the word risk. He tells himself he is being prudent, measured, professional. But prudence and fear have always shared the same mask. His silence maintains order and costs integrity. The same trade that once kept thrones stable now keeps consciences still. The narrator breathes slowly, reflective. Obedience is not born from cruelty alone. It is born from love, our longing to belong, to be approved, to stay unharmed. The queens understood this intimately. Their silence was not passivity. It was devotion to family, to nation, to survival itself. We, too, practice the same devotion daily, though the crowns we protect are invisible. Careers, reputations, relationships, peace. Yet obedience has its psychology of comfort. There is relief in conformity, in being the one who does not speak, the one who avoids consequence. That relief is ancient. The same comfort that once made courtiers bow now makes citizens scroll past injustice. Workers nod at decisions they despise. Lovers swallow the words that could change everything. Silence promises safety, and safety promises belonging. But belonging, bought at that price, begins to feel like exile. The narrator's tone becomes almost tender. The line between obedience and self-erasure is thinner than it seems. Each time we choose not to speak, something in us agrees to vanish a little. Not forever, just enough to stay unseen. And that vanishing, multiplied across millions of people and generations, becomes history's quietest continuity, the way silence travels through time like inheritance. Still, the story does not accuse, it invites reflection. The Queen's silence was necessity. Ours is often choice, though disguised, and in that choice lies possibility. To understand obedience is not to condemn it, but to recognize its origin. It was never weakness, it was intelligence adapted to danger. The problem is not that we learned it. The problem is that the danger has changed while the instinct remains. The narrator paints a modern echo of the ancient ritual. In a courtroom, a witness hesitates. In a parliament, a voice is cut off mid-sentence. On a phone, a person starts typing a message of truth, then deletes it. These moments are small, almost invisible. Yet they are the places where history repeats itself, where the silence of queens finds new shape in modern hearts. The camera of imagination shifts outward. The world glows with lighted windows, offices, apartments, bedrooms. Behind each, someone stays quiet when they wish to speak. The reasons vary: fear, fatigue, loyalty, hope, yet all connect back to the same inheritance, the ancient pact between power and quiet endurance. The narrator's voice steadies, both clinical and compassionate. Conditioning does not end when laws change. It ends when perception changes. The queens lived in a time when speech could kill. We live in one where silence can, too, in slower, quieter ways. Every time truth is withheld to keep the peace, every time authenticity is sacrificed for approval, the empire of silence expands. But recognition is the first breach. Once seen, the pattern cannot stay hidden. When a person pauses before speaking and asks, "Why am I afraid?" that question alone begins to crumble centuries of conditioning. The psychology of obedience is sustained only by unexamined habit. Awareness is its undoing. The narrator softens again, inviting reflection rather than guilt. The age of queens ended, but their silence lives quietly inside us all. It moves through gestures and courtesies, through the way we smile when we wish to argue, through the way we defer even when we are right. But knowing where it comes from, knowing that it was born in fear and perfected in love, gives us the power to change it. The section closes not with accusation, but understanding. The listener can almost see a modern figure standing before a mirror, hearing the echo of those ancient women behind her. The reflection feels shared centuries of endurance looking back through her eyes. The narrator's final words fall softly, like advice given at midnight. Silence is not our inheritance, it is our translation. And what was learned in fear can be unlearned in safety. The quiet holds for a moment, reflective, alive. Beyond it lies the next step. The release, the unburdening, the moment when silence, at last, begins to turn into speech. Morning arrives slowly over the centuries, light spreading through the long corridors of history like breath after a long-held note. The darkness does not vanish, it softens. What was once silence begins to shimmer with sound. Not the noise of revolt, but something gentler, braver, the voices of those who have begun to listen. The narrator's tone is warm, almost luminous. What begins in silence can end in song if someone dares to listen. For generations, silence was a sentence. Now it becomes a seed. Across the world, scholars, artists, and storytellers are kneeling in the soil of forgotten lives, brushing away dust, coaxing old words back to life. Each discovery is not merely historical, it is healing. In a dim archive in Vienna, a researcher reads Marie Antoinette's final letters aloud to an audience of students. Her voice trembles at first, then steadies. The room grows so quiet that even the sound of paper turning feels reverent. When she reaches the last line, "I am calm as I have always wished to be," there is a pause, then a hush of recognition. The Queen's poise, once misunderstood as vanity, is now heard as courage. The silence that once confined her has become her instrument, her melody carried forward through time. Elsewhere, in a London theatre, a playwright reimagines Catherine de' Medici not as villain, but as strategist, a woman juggling chaos with wit and composure. The audience leans forward, captivated. The dialogue is sharp, modern, alive. When the actress delivers the line, "They said I ruled through fear, I ruled through listening," applause ripples through the hall like a breaking spell. History, for a moment, sounds human again. The narrator's voice glows with quiet joy. The world begins to speak the names differently. Painters depict queens laughing. Poets borrow their words, unearthing humour and longing where tragedy once reigned. Historians write with empathy instead of distance. The queens, reborn in film, novels, and essays, no longer belong to their kings or their courts. They belong to those who finally hear them. In a university classroom, a young woman writes a dissertation titled "The Grammar of Grace, Silence as Strategy in Early Modern Queenship." Her argument is tender and fierce all at once. That restraint was never absence, but communication coded to survive. Her conclusion reads, "They did not lose their voices. They taught us how to listen for quieter forms of truth." When she defends her thesis, the panel applauds softly, aware that something sacred has been reclaimed. The camera of imagination moves outward to galleries, stages, and city streets. Street murals show queens not as mournful relics, but as living presences. Eleanor of Aquitaine, holding a quill, Isabella with her hand on a globe, Elizabeth I laughing under starlight. Their images no longer stare solemnly from history. They look forward, as if aware that their silence has become a new language, one written by those who refuse to forget. The narrator lingers on the transformation. Art becomes apology, and remembrance becomes repair. Where once their restraint was romanticized as virtue, it is now recognized as survival. Their quiet is no longer imposed, it is chosen, repurposed. The same silence that once built empires now builds empathy. The power that once demanded obedience now inspires reflection. Films retell their lives with nuance. Documentaries reveal diaries and letters once locked away, narrating them in their own words instead of through historians' filters. The queens are no longer symbols of submission, they are case studies in endurance, wit, and adaptability. Audiences cry, not out of pity but out of kinship. They recognize in those centuries-old struggles something startlingly present. The same fight for understanding, the same longing to be heard without being devoured by noise. In Paris, a poet stands before an audience and reads from a new collection titled "The Quiet Crown." Her voice trembles at first, then steadies into rhythm. One stanza reads, "They thought her silence ended her, but it was the pause before the chorus. They buried her words, and we learned to dig with our tongues." The listeners exhale together. The applause is not loud, it is reverent, like prayer. The narrator softens, contemplative. Healing does not erase history. It rewrites its rhythm. The rediscovery of these voices does not undo their suffering, but it transforms what silence means. It is no longer an ending, it is an invitation. To speak differently, to listen deeper, to understand that history's hush was not empty, but waiting for ears that could bear its truth. The tone shifts from historical to universal. Silence, once a weapon of control, becomes a sanctuary for reflection. The women who once endured it now guide those who face new forms of voicelessness, whether through inequality, censorship, or exhaustion. Their stories remind us that even quiet endurance can contain infinite strength. Their courage is no longer confined to thrones. It belongs to every person who has ever hesitated before speaking and decided to try anyway. The narrator paints a quiet montage. Classrooms where students analyze letters by candlelight. Film sets where directors debate how to honor truth without embellishment. Museum curators adjusting the lighting so that a queen's painted gaze looks more alive. Each gesture, however small, feels like restoration. The act of remembering has become collective therapy, a dialogue across centuries. And it is not only women who listen. Men, too, begin to understand the burden of inherited silence, the ways they have been trained to command without hearing, to lead without empathy. The healing voice, the narrator explains, does not belong to one gender. It is the sound of balance returning after centuries of distortion. The rediscovery of the Queen's words heals both the silenced and the deafened. The narrator's voice grows brighter, hopeful. Silence was the language of survival. Speech is the language of becoming. To speak now is not rebellion, it is continuation. The queens taught endurance, their heirs teach release. Every essay, every performance, every whispered confession carries a fragment of that legacy forward. In one final image, the narrator describes a modern artist sculpting a series of marble busts. Each queen's face is carved not in still serenity, but in motion mouths slightly parted, as if mid-sentence. When the exhibit opens, visitors walk through the gallery, listening to faint recordings of women reading the Queen's words aloud. The sound echoes softly against the stone, centuries of silence turning finally into voice. The narrator pauses. What begins in silence can end in song if someone dares to listen. Outside the gallery, dawn rises. The city hums with traffic and conversation, the noise of ordinary life. Yet somewhere beneath that noise, something new has taken root, a deeper listening, a quieter courage. The inheritance of silence has become the inheritance of awareness. The final lines arrive like sunlight across a window pane. Their voices were never gone. They were only waiting for us to slow down, to soften, to hear. And now, at last, we do. The narrator's voice fades into calm, the music lifting like daybreak after centuries of dusk. The story widens again, beyond gender and history, towards something vast and shared, the human art of finding meaning in silence, and music in the act of finally speaking. Silence has always been older than speech. Before words, there was breath. Before thought, the pause that allowed it to form. The narrator's voice moves gently, reverently, as if tracing an invisible thread that stretches from ancient queens to the quiet hearts of today. Silence was never weakness. It was how humanity learned to survive itself. The story widens beyond the palaces, beyond the lineage of queens, into the vast human story. Across deserts and oceans, mountains and empires, people have always known when to hold their tongues. A monk in a Tibetan monastery sits for hours in wordless meditation. A peasant woman in medieval France hums to her child instead of praying aloud, because the church forbids her language. A writer under dictatorship burns his own pages so his family will live. Their silences are not the same, yet each speaks the same ancient truth. When speech becomes dangerous, quiet becomes wisdom. The narrator's tone deepens, soft but certain. Silence is not absence, it is adaptation. It bends to fit the needs of survival. Sometimes it hides, sometimes it protects, sometimes it listens so deeply that it begins to understand more than speech ever could. Humanity, in its long journey through fear and faith, has always used quiet as shelter. In one part of the world, silence is reverence. The desert fathers of early Christianity believed that the soul speaks only when the mouth is still. In another, silence is rebellion. In the slave plantations of the Americas, songs carried hidden maps and quiet looks past warnings. Even now, silence remains a secret language between those who must endure unseen migrant workers, political prisoners, lovers in forbidden places. The narrator describes this continuity with awe. Every era invents its own form of quiet. The Queen's poised restraint was no different from the whispered prayers of the powerless. It was the same instinct wearing a crown. Both used silence as armor against a world that mistook noise for strength. Both learned that survival often depends on withholding what is most true. The story lingers in moments of human stillness, a courtroom where no one speaks because the truth would condemn them all, a hospital corridor where grief is too large for sound, a moment between two friends, where one simply listens until the other finally exhales. Silence is not empty here, it is full, shaped by emotion too intricate for language. The narrator softens further. Speech divides, silence connects. The act of holding back creates space for others to exist beside us. Across cultures, silence becomes ritual. A minute's quiet for the dead, a pause before prayer, the unspoken bond between strangers in mourning. These are not passive moments, they are collective acts of endurance. Humanity survives not only through communication, but through restraint. The queens, in this light, they were not exceptions. They were emblems of something. All people understand instinctively, the price of being heard. Their palaces were grander, but their fear was ordinary. Their careful smiles mirror the expressions still worn today in meetings, in families, in relationships where harmony is built upon unsaid truths. The centuries shrink, the psychology remains. The narrator's tone turns contemplative. Every silence is a negotiation between fear and faith. Fear that speaking might bring pain. Faith that quiet might preserve meaning until the world is ready to hear it. The queens lived this faith. Their restraint, their composure, their patience, all born from the hope that survival today might allow truth tomorrow. And in that hope lies the secret architecture of civilization itself, the idea that endurance precedes revelation. The story shifts outward again, into the shared present. In crowded cities, people move through each other's noise, each carrying a small private quiet, the pause between messages, the breath before confession, the word withheld in mercy. Silence has become rarer, yet more sacred. It no longer protects us from swords, but from exhaustion. It is how the human spirit steadies itself amid the constant roar of its own creation. The narrator paints a quiet scene. A woman sits by her window at midnight, phone turned face down, letting the city hum outside. She is not hiding from the world, she is recovering from it. In that small act of stillness, she repeats the oldest ritual of survival. She listens inward, as queens once did, and discovers that silence is not submission but return. The world teaches us to speak, to assert, to claim. Yet every heart knows that wisdom lives in the space before response. Empires were not only built by speeches and decrees, they were maintained by pauses, by the unsaid agreements that kept peace, by the quiet resilience that endured between wars. Humanity's progress has always depended on its ability to stop, to reflect, to choose words carefully. The narrator's tone becomes almost meditative now. Perhaps silence was humanity's first intelligence, the instinct to wait before sound, to feel before action. Even the universe, before it burned into light, existed in quiet darkness. In that sense, silence is not an invention of fear, but a reflection of the cosmos itself, a rhythm older than civilization. From the queens to the commoner, from temple to city street, the pattern repeats. Silence is not retreat, it is recalibration. It is how we adapt, how we protect what is fragile inside us, until it can emerge whole. When humanity speaks too soon, it destroys. When it waits, it endures. The narrator lowers their voice to a near whisper. We survive not because we are loud, but because we are listening. The queens listen to the moods of kings, the peasants to the seasons of the earth, the oppressed to the footsteps of danger. Listening became evolution's greatest defense, the art of surviving without confrontation, of learning before reacting. And yet, silence is never eternal. It carries the promise of eventual voice. Every pause contains potential, every withheld word the seed of renewal. Humanity's quiet, from ancient caves to modern cities, is a rehearsal for understanding. The queens, in their endurance, taught not how to be mute, but how to wait until truth could be heard. The narrator concludes with calm reverence. Silence was never weakness. It was how humanity learned to survive itself. Across all eras, it has been the bridge between chaos and comprehension, between danger and peace. It is the hum beneath language, the pause that gives words meaning. It is how we hold the world, without breaking it. The final image fades slowly. A river moving beneath starlight, its surface smooth, its current strong. Voices echo faintly from its depths, royal, common, ancient, modern, all dissolving into the same soundless flow. The queens have become water now, the human story still moving, still enduring. And above it all, the narrator's voice, soft as a breath. To be silent is not to disappear. It is to remain patient, observant, alive. The silence deepens, not as emptiness, but as continuation. The story now prepares for its final descent toward what remains after everything unsaid, and what silence finally teaches those who are still listening. The world exhales. History, at last, grows quiet. The noise of empires, the rhythm of armies, the murmur of scholars and gossipers all dissolve into something lighter than air. What remains are traces. Candle smoke twisting upward, a half-burned letter, a line of ink fading to ghost. The narrator's tone drifts between reverence and melancholy. Sometimes history is written not in ink, but in everything it dared not say. This is the moment after the last word, the silence that follows centuries of breath held too long. Across the ruins of palaces and libraries, across fields where thrones once cast shadows, the echoes begin to fade. What lingers is not absence, but essence, the weight of what wasn't spoken, what could not be said, what was never allowed to become sound. The queens are gone. Their voices, once rediscovered, reimagined, retold, now settle into stillness again. But this time, the silence feels different. It is not forced, it is full. Like dusk after a storm, it carries the memory of everything endured. The narrator's words unfold slowly, like hands opening. Silence does not end when speech begins. It becomes memory, the invisible architecture of all that was felt and never named. In this final descent, history becomes less like a book and more like breath. What we remember is not the details, but the temperature of the world they lived in, the warmth of candlelight over parchment, the cool of corridors where footsteps once whispered. The listener can almost see it. A letter half read, its ink dissolving into rain, a hand reaching for quill and stopping the thought too dangerous to complete. Each of these moments, tiny, unrecorded, becomes its own monument. The narrator contemplates this loss without sorrow. Perhaps the world needed their restraint so we could learn to hear our own noise. Every unspoken word left a space that the future would fill. Their silence became the echo that taught us to listen, the unfinished sentence that made us wonder what else could have been true. In that wondering, meaning survives. Somewhere, in a museum, a curator closes the lid of an archive box. Inside rest centuries of correspondence letters that will never again be read aloud. The air inside the box holds the faintest scent of ink and dust, the ghost of touch. The silence there is almost tangible. It is not the hush of death, but the quiet of completion. The words have done their work. The world has finally heard them. The narrator's voice softens to a whisper. Every story ends in silence, not because there is nothing left to say, but because there is nothing left to prove. The queens who began in obedience and endured in quiet have reached a kind of grace beyond language. Their silences, multiplied by time, have become part of the world's stillness, the soft undertone that hums beneath all music, all prayer, all thought. The scene shifts to an image of candle smoke spiraling upward, then vanishing into air. It does not disappear. It becomes part of the room, unseen but present. So too, with the words unsaid. They do not die, they diffuse. Every hesitation, every withheld confession, every thought too fragile to voice, becomes the unseen current guiding human understanding. What is left unspoken becomes the oxygen of empathy. The narrator lingers here, slow and reflective. We measure history by what was declared, but we live it through what was withheld. The great speeches and revolutions fill textbooks, but the quiet decisions, the unvoiced forgiveness, the swallowed anger, the hidden grief, are what truly shape humanity. In the stillness between sound and silence, identity takes root. The story returns to the queens one last time, though now they are less figures than presences. Eleanor, Catherine, Elizabeth, Marie, they no longer speak. They do not need to. Their restraint has become universal, their quiet absorbed into the collective pulse of civilization. Their words, once buried, once recovered, now rest again this time, not in oppression but in peace. They have said enough by saying so little. A faint breeze moves through the imagined chamber of the mind, rustling unseen curtains. The narrator describes it as the breath of time itself, the motion that carries memory forward even after memory has fallen asleep. Every life leaves behind two histories, the one recorded and the one remembered in silence. The first fades, the second endures. The tone grows tender, almost spiritual. The weight of unspoken things is not a burden but a balance, the necessary counterpoint to language, the reminder that truth does not always need a voice to exist. The Queen's lives, seen from this distance, resemble prayers whispered to no one and answered by everyone. Their silence has become the shared heartbeat of all who have ever endured quietly, all who have ever loved without acknowledgement, all who have ever known that words can break what silence protects. The narrator pauses, allowing space to breathe. Maybe the truest form of expression is not sound, but attention. The Queens gave their attention to survival, to understanding, to the shape of consequence. They studied the spaces between words until they learned what could never be said aloud. Their inheritance to us is not language, it is awareness. The imagery grows sparser now. Candlelight dims. The last page of a book turns by itself. Dust dances in the glow of dawn. A single feather from an old quill drifts to the floor, landing softly beside a stack of untouched parchment. It feels like a benediction, quiet, unassuming, eternal. The narrator's tone narrows to a breath. The weight of what wasn't spoken is what keeps the world from shattering. It grounds us in humility, reminding us that even the most eloquent eras depend on restraint. The unsaid preserves the sacred. It holds what cannot be simplified or resolved. It keeps mystery alive. In the end, every civilization builds its monuments to noise cathedrals, archives, speeches. But it survives on the patience of its silences. The Queens knew this. They may not have written the loudest words, but they wrote the longest ones, the kind that outlast sound itself. Their legacies rest not in proclamation, but in pause. The story begins to settle. The narrator speaks slower, almost indistinguishably from the music beneath. Silence does not erase, it distills. What remains after everything unsaid is not emptiness, but clarity. The noise of history fades, and what's left is pure a hum, a heartbeat, a calm that holds all that has ever been lost. The final image unfolds like a closing eyelid, a candle guttering, a page half filled, a sigh that could belong to anyone across time. The smoke rises one last time and disappears into the dark. And then, only the narrator's whisper. Sometimes, history is written not in ink, but in everything it dared not say. The silence that follows is not absence, it is peace. The story rests there, as if finally allowed to sleep. The voice softens like candlelight at dawn. The world that once thundered with coronations and executions now lies still, dust settling into its final order. The narrator speaks almost in a whisper, as though addressing both the listener and the centuries themselves. Every story ends in silence. But some silences are sacred. The Queens return not as names or faces, but as faint warmth moving through the quiet. Their presence no longer carries weight or sorrow. It drifts like the scent of something familiar you can't quite place, a memory that no longer hurts. They are no longer queens, nor martyrs, nor symbols. They are what remains after meaning dissolves the soft awareness that history's deepest truths are not spoken, but felt. The narrator's tone is serene, hypnotic. Perhaps what they could not say was not failure, but wisdom preserved in quiet. The silence that once confined them has changed shape. It is no longer a wall, it is a horizon. It holds everything now, the words they never spoke, the tears they never showed, the patience they never lost. What once felt tragic now feels tender, as if silence was always their way of teaching us how to listen. One can almost imagine them gathered not in a throne room, but in a meadow beyond time. Eleanor, Marie, Catherine, Elizabeth, unburdened, unjudged. No jewels, no crowns, no courtiers. Only morning light, soft and endless. Their faces are calm, not because they must be, but because peace finally fits them. The world no longer demands their restraint, it simply receives it. The narrator breathes slowly, each word drawn like the tide. Silence is not the opposite of life, it is its completion. Every word they ever withheld now hums inside the air, unmeasured and free. Their endurance has turned into presence, their restraint into grace. Where once they were trapped by history's gaze, they are now part of its stillness, the steady pulse beneath the noise of all things. The tone becomes almost lullaby-like, each sentence flowing into the next without edge. The listener can feel the shift. This is not history now, but something gentler, more eternal. The story has travelled through power and loss, rebellion and rediscovery, only to arrive at what was always waiting, the peace that follows understanding. In this light, their silences no longer feel like absence, but invitation. They ask nothing, demand nothing. They simply are. Their quiet radiates a kind of wisdom, older than language. The knowledge that every truth must one day fall still, that every life must learn to rest in what cannot be said. The queens, who once bore silence like armour, now wear it like light. The narrator describes this transformation in imagery, both intimate and cosmic. Candle smoke curling upward becomes mist over a morning field. A quill left on a desk becomes a branch resting in a stream. The hum of an unseen choir replaces the noise of the court. The world continues, but softer now, as if it, too, has learned humility. There is no sadness in their departure, only stillness. The queens have dissolved into time's gentler currents, the breath between centuries, the pause before a song begins. Their silence has become language again, one that does not need translation. It speaks through calm, through balance, through the grace of things finally at rest. The narrator reflects, every empire ends in dust, but dust itself remembers form. The same is true of silence. It remembers the shape of every word that once tried to live inside it. The queen's restraint was never erasure. It was preservation. They kept the sacred unbroken by speech, holding the fragile truths of their age until the world was ready to hear them. Now, centuries later, we listen. We hear not their words, but their rhythm, the slow, steady patience that outlasted crowns and wars and judgment. We realize that silence, when chosen, is not submission, but serenity. It is the soul's way of standing unshaken in the wind. The narrator pauses. A soft sound fills the space, wind through trees, perhaps, or the echo of a chapel bell fading into distance. This is how all stories end, not with applause, not with revelation, but with return. The queens return to the quiet from which they came, and we, having followed them through the corridors of time, find ourselves breathing a little slower, as if sharing their peace. The imagery narrows to a single candle burning low on a wooden table. Its flame flickers but does not die. Around it the shadows move gently, like memories letting go of shape. The air feels warm, forgiving. The narrator speaks almost as a lullaby now. What remains after the noise is what was true all along, the calm beneath every storm, the silence that waits for us all. The queen's stories are complete. Their silence, once mistaken for tragedy, stands revealed as a kind of quiet triumph. They did not outlast history by force, but by grace. The power they were denied became the patience they bestowed. And now, their silence belongs to no one. It belongs to the world itself. The final words arrive like breath returning home. Every story ends in silence. But some silences are sacred. The music fades into stillness. The last candle gutters, then steadies one final time before going out, not extinguished, but fulfilled. The darkness that follows is gentle, luminous, alive. And the listener, somewhere between waking and sleep, feels the silence settle not as an ending, but as an exhale long overdue. The screen fades to quiet. The music thins to a single note that barely trembles, then dissolves. What remains is the sound of pages turning slow, deliberate, like breath through an old library. The voice returns softer than before, almost indistinguishable from the air itself. The silence of the queens becomes the silence of night. The camera drifts through empty corridors, where light pools gently across marble floors. Portraits watch from the walls, their colours faded but their eyes unchanged. Dust moves through the air like slow snow. Every detail feels suspended between existence and memory. The narrator speaks as though describing a dream that refuses to end. Perhaps silence was never meant to be broken. Perhaps it was meant to be shared. The footsteps of history echo faintly, then fade. A curtain stirs, though no wind moves. Somewhere, far away, a bell rings once, not to call or to mourn, but to measure the space between what was and what remains. The camera glides past a mirror, and for a moment the reflection shows no face, only light, as if the past itself has learned to let go. The voice continues, almost a whisper. We began in noise, in prophecy, in command, in the endless chorus of kings. But it was silence that endured. It outlasted the crowns, the marble, the words written to glorify or condemn. It waited patiently until the world grew still enough to hear itself. The night deepens. The narration slows. It feels less like storytelling now and more like meditation language, softening into rhythm, rhythm into breath. Every story must end where it began, in quiet, in the space before the first sound, in the hush that asks nothing but awareness. The scene widens. The camera rises above the old palaces, Versailles, El Escorial, Westminster, the Louvre, each now sleeping beneath the same calm sky. Their roofs gleam faintly beneath the moon, their windows reflecting nothing but stars. The world below is at rest. The pulse of cities hums like a slow heartbeat, gentle, alive, endless. The narrator's tone becomes lighter, more distant, as though carried by wind. All the words they could not say became the stillness that teaches us how to listen. That is the secret of the queens. Their silence was never loss. It was transformation. The sound of pages continues, each turn softer than the last. A book lies open on a table, its final paragraph incomplete. The ink stops mid-sentence, yet it feels whole. Around it, the air glows faintly, the afterimage of thought. The narrator breathes. In the quiet of night we hear them still, not as voices but as presence. They move in the hush between heartbeats, in the soft pauses of speech, in the peace that follows understanding. Outside, dawn begins its slow return. The first light touches stone and glass, turning shadows into colour. The air feels lighter now, as though history itself exhales. Birds begin to stir, but even their calls sound reverent, subdued. The world is waking, but carefully, unwilling to disturb the fragile calm. The narrator continues, each word drawn from stillness. The queens are no longer waiting to be heard. They have become the listening itself, the patience of time, the gentleness of endurance. Their silence is not behind us. It surrounds us. It lives in every moment when we choose peace over pride, when we breathe instead of argue, when we listen instead of speak. The imagery shifts inward to the listener. A darkened room, the glow of a screen, a face lit softly by the story's fading light. The voice speaks directly now, yet with infinite gentleness. You, too, carry the silence they left behind. It rests behind your eyes, in the part of you that remembers what cannot be explained. You know it when you pause before replying, when you look at the stars and feel their distance like a kind of comfort. The narration drifts like tide water. Silence is not emptiness, it is the world at peace with itself. The camera moves once more through the remnants of time. An empty throne room, vines curling through cracks in marble, a candle burning in a chapel no longer used. The flame bends slightly, then steadies. The air shimmers with morning. Every ruin looks tender now, every shadow kind. Every story ends in silence, the voice repeats, but not every silence ends the story. The Queen's quiet has become a river that flows through all things, a current that carries memory without pain. In its depths, every life that has ever listened finds rest. The tone grows almost imperceptible, as if the narrator is no longer speaking but thinking aloud. What was once obedience becomes understanding. What was once fear becomes grace. What was once silence becomes eternity. The screen fills with light. The camera glides slowly upward, rising above Earth, showing oceans and continents bathed in dawn. The faint sound of breath, perhaps the narrator's, perhaps the planet's, becomes the only rhythm left. The silence of the queens was never theirs alone. It was humanity's rehearsal for peace. The light deepens to gold. The final image appears. An open window, white curtains moving with the morning air. A feather drifts through the sunlight and settles on the sill. Outside, the world is bright and waiting. Inside, everything is still. The narrator's final words arrive like a prayer more than a statement. Every secret ends in silence. Every silence ends in light. Listen and the quiet will tell you everything. The music swells gently, a few notes rising like the first breath after sleep. Then it fades completely. The screen turns to white. For a moment, there is nothing, only the sound of calm. and that too is part of the story.